The Serpentine Subterfuge. Chapter 10. Just as Rigel had gotten her wits together after overhearing that unsettling conversation, the peaceful solitude of the balcony was broken. One of the doors to her balcony opened, spilling eerie music and two easily recognizable Slytherins out into the night. "You see," Alden Rosier was saying to his companion, "I told you Mother opened 7 of the ballroom balconies, not 6. As always, the world bows to your superior understanding of it," Rookwood drawled. Rosier snorted a laugh, then seemed to pause. Their silhouettes were hard to see, being backlit by the ballroom light, but it looked like Rosier was peering intently at Rookwood from where she sat against the stone railing looking up at them. "Are you patronizing me?" "Would I dare?" Rookwood asked mildly. "I think you are." Rosier laughed a bit. "If you're already being sardonically patient with me, perhaps I should refrain from the refreshment table for a bit." "That would be wise," Rookwood agreed. He turned to look at Rigel, still sitting on the ground, and Rosier followed suit. "Aha! There's our wayward charge." Rosier came forward, and Rigel noticed his steps seemed to be a tad unsteady, thought it was suspicious that one of the opened balconies was darkened and closed. "I said to myself, who is the most suspicious person at the party? For that is bound to be the same person who closed up the balcony, and I answered myself, why, Rigel Black, of course. And lo and behold, here you are. Am I not terribly clever?" Meanwhile Rookwood had closed the doors to the ballroom again and moved to relight the lamp. Rigel was still trying to process the fact that Alden Rosier believed her to be the most suspicious person at Riddle's Gullah. Rosier crouched down in front of her and wagged a finger admonishingly. "Didn't I tell you not to wander too far, little imp? I told you, Rookwood, and I would find you. Didn't you think we'd find you?" Rigel looked questioningly from Rosier to Rookwood, who had an air of resignation about him. "Don't pay him any mind, Black. Alden has had too much punch." "Punch?" Rigel lifted a brow. "Has someone spiked it?" She dearly hoped it hadn't been serious. Rookwood shook his head. "Impossible. If someone can slip alcohol into the refreshments, what's to stop them from slipping in poison? No, the punch was intended to be alcoholic." Rigel blinked. Pansy was drinking the punch. "She was drinking from the children's bowl," Rookwood said, glancing at Rosier, who had given up crouching and was sitting cross-legged in front of Rigel, mostly just staring at her curiously. Alden was not. "Is it true you propositioned Edmund tonight?" Alden asked out of nowhere. Rigel glanced awkwardly away from the two upperclassmen. "Just a misunderstanding, Rosier." "Don't call me that," Rosier said absently, adding, "You should have come to me, you know. Edmund is such a tease, but I wouldn't have left you out here in the cold." Rigel quite honestly couldn't think of anything to say to that. "I think you've said enough," Alden Rookwood said, stepping forward to haul Rosier to his feet. Rosier leaned against Rookwood tiredly. "Don't be cross with me, Edmund, you know I hate that. Didn't I tell you I was sorry about Alice? She only danced with me to make you jealous, old boy, even I could see." "That's enough," Alden Rookwood said, sighing. "What am I going to do with you?" "I don't care," Rosier said morosely, "only don't be cross with me, Ed." He leaned up and gave Rookwood a smacking kiss to his cheek. "There," Rosier said, "now you can't be." Rosier suddenly slumped and Rookwood shifted his weight to balance the two of them easily. Rigel scrambled up, but Rookwood waved her off and set Rosier gently down on the balcony floor. "No need for alarm," he told her, "just a mild sleeping charm. It will wear off in half an hour or so, I expect." Rigel noticed then that Rookwood's wand was in his hand as he used the other to pluck Alden's handkerchief from his pocket. Rookwood first used the handkerchief to wipe off his cheek where Rosier had kissed him, then transfigured it into a pillow and placed it under his friend's head. She wondered briefly how he'd gotten around the underage magic restriction, but supposed that the Rosiers, like the Blacks, warded their home in a way that contained the trace. "Watch him, won't you?" he asked her, standing up and brushing his dress robes off. Rigel looked from Rookwood to Rosier. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. You owe me for explaining to Pansy why she'd be dancing the third set with me," Black Rookwood pointed out. "Just stay here until he wakes up, and don't let him back into the ballroom unless he's sober. His mother will be displeased to notice him missing, but even more displeased were he to embarrass himself." "I do owe you a favor," Rigel acknowledged, "but I am somewhat concerned about what this will look like once you leave." Rookwood gazed at her patiently. I doubt anyone would think that about a boy your age. Rigel frowned. I don't think age has much to do with it, if you've got a wand. A wand. Rookwood broke off with an uncomfortable cough. I fear we are once again on very different pages, Black. Rigel frowned. I just don't think people will find it terribly implausible that a Black attacked the son of his host on a secluded balcony. My family history doesn't lend itself well to protestations of innocence. Rookwood blinked, as though he hadn't considered that at all. I'm sure they won't think you attacked Alden, he said with amusement, but if they do, I will set them straight. In any case, it is unlikely that anyone will venture out here before the dancing ends, and by then Alden should be awake enough to explain. All right, Rigel said, reclaiming her semi-comfortable seat against the balcony railing. There were runes for heat carved into the stone every several feet, so it wasn't really any hardship to remain out on the balcony for a little while longer. At least she now had a real reason to miss more of the dancing. The night was quiet, and it was easy to turn her mind to other things in the piece. After about 20 minutes, though, loud voices began to carry over from the next balcony over. There was a good 15 feet between the balconies, and the ballroom was circular, so it wasn't a straight line of sight from one balcony to the other. Rigel's balcony was downwind of the balcony next to it, though, so the voices carried rather clearly to where she sat. She didn't recognize either of the voices, but could tell that one of them was male and the other female. Unharmed me this instant, Rodolphus, the woman's voice said. I am going back inside. No, Bella, a man answered. His voice was deep, but not calm or rumbling like Rookwood's was. This man's voice was rough and harsh. I think you'd better cool your head right here for a while. The woman scoffed loudly. I do not have time for this. How dare you presume to? Presume, the man laughed, and it was a bitter sound. Is it now presumptuous for a husband to prevent his wife from making a bloody fool of herself in front of all and sundry? The only fool here is you, if you think you can tell me what to do, the woman snapped back. Rigel now had a pretty good idea of who the two were, and was feeling a bit uncomfortable about overhearing a domestic dispute between one of Archie's cousins and her husband. The only Rodolphus she knew of was Rodolphus Lestrange, and she only knew of him because he was married to Bellatrix Lestrange née Black. Archie had made her at least attempt to memorize the last 3 branches of his family tree, and several of the most recent names had stuck by default. You will listen to me, woman, or so help me I will apparate us both home this instant, Rodolphus growled at his wife. What is your problem, Rodolphus? Bellatrix hissed. You pull me away from a conversation with Lord Riddle himself to what? Complain that your wife isn't paying you enough attention. There was a pause in which Rigel wondered idly if her magic would stop up her ears if she asked it to, even though she really shouldn't use magic outside of school, wards or no wards. Is that it, Ruddy? Are you jealous tonight? Hardly, Lestrange said shortly. How could I be jealous of a man who doesn't even want you? Don't be that way, darling, Bellatrix said lowly, her voice barely carrying now over the wind. I'll make it up to you, you know I always do. There were a few moments of silence in which Rigel tried not to imagine what was happening just one balcony over. This night had really been a shock to the sensibilities, and she was starting to wonder if maybe Lily had had a point about not wanting Archie to attend. No, Bella, stop this now, Lestrange said, his voice even more rough than before. You will not win your way so easily this time. I tell you, this must stop. You don't really want me to stop, Bellatrix's voice said seductively. Bella, Rodolphus said, breaking off with a low groan. That's it, Bellatrix said, coaxingly. And then there were no more words, only vague and uncomfortable noises that caused Rigel to flush with embarrassment on their behalf. She sat in the dark and just prayed to Merlin that no one discovered her. The only thing more embarrassing than being stuck listening to other people trysting would have to be being caught listening to other people trysting. Just then a low groan cut through the other, more distant groans coming from the next balcony. Rosia twitched on the ground next to her and let out another groan, slightly louder. Cursing silently, Rigel leaned over and covered his mouth with her hand. MMH. Rosia blearily opened his eyes and froze. He peered at her, his gaze sharpening rapidly as it adjusted to the lamplight. It's Rigel Black, Rigel whispered, leaning over. You are on one of the balconies at your family's mansion. Rookwood left you out here to sleep off your state of mind. HMPH. Rosia grunted questioningly, pointedly looking down to where her hand covered his mouth. Rigel smothered a smile at what a ridiculous night this was turning out to be. In the next balcony over, my cousin Bellatrix and her husband are indisposed. I'd rather they not notice us here. Rosia's eyes widened and he sat up, pushing away her hand with a grin. Oh, mother will have a fit when she hears, he said cheerfully. Sure, Rigel said, frowning. Rosia gave her an impatient look. Oh, desist, Black. We are downwind, obviously. Indeed, the moans coming from the balcony next to them were becoming more and more difficult to ignore. Besides, he produced his wand with a flourish. We are wizards, in case you've forgotten. Underage wizards, Rigel pointed out. She was subsequently ignored. Rosia cast an area effect charm that caused a thin, silvery barrier not unlike a shimmering bubble to float into existence in a 5-foot radius around them. The noises from the next balcony stopped immediately, as did all of the cricket sounds and rustling noises from the garden below them, and the faint, haunting melodies from the ballroom as well. Rosia stretched out his legs and leaned against the stone railing next to her. So, Rookwood dumped me into your jurisdiction, did he? He laughed. I can't believe he endured that kiss for a full 2 seconds before somniuming me. That's a good half-second longer than last time. Last time? Rigel asked before she could stop herself. Purebloods were even weirder than she thought. Rosia just grinned cat-like at her. It's something of a tradition at this point. I get sloshed after a ridiculously small amount of liquor. Rookwood puts up with me until I become overly friendly, and then I'm out like a light until my mind returns to itself. He's really getting quite good at the sleeping hex, you know, barely felt a thing that time. Rigel made a non-committal noise to show she was listening but didn't really want to talk about it. Oh, I've made you uncomfortable, haven't I? Rosia said, smiling unapologetically. Was it when I asked you if you'd made a pass at Edmund, or when I made a veiled one at you shortly thereafter? Rigel grimaced, and glanced away from him. Ah, the second, then. Rosia went on, voice laced with condescension. My apologies for making designs on your virtue, Mr. Black. Sometimes my facetiousness runs away with my good sense after a drop or two. If you know, then why do you keep drinking? Rigel asked, turning back to look questioningly at him, especially at a party like this. One day when you grow up and hate your family, too, you will drink at their parties, and impertinent little whelps like you will ask you why, Rosia drawled, picking up the transfigured pillow from the floor and placing it behind his neck fastidiously. I could never hate my family, Rigel said, frowning. You say that now, Rosia said, snorting. Just wait until your adolescent hormones inform you otherwise. There comes a day when you see your family for what they really are, and there isn't a person on earth who wouldn't be in that moment disappointed. I don't know. Rigel said slowly. If I don't hate them by now, I don't think I ever will. People don't grow worse over time, really, and I haven't been living with my eyes closed for 12 years. I've never been one to see people as better than they really are, even if I care for them. I know my family, Rosia, and I accept their shortcomings. You accept them, but you don't like them, Rosia said shrewdly. Deep down you resent them, just a little. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's natural, and inevitable. You're lucky, if what you say is true, because you're the kind that became accustomed to your family's imperfections over time. For others, it hits all at once, in an instant of shattering clarity, and after that it's almost impossible to summon the kind of acceptance you describe. They seem very nice, Rigel offered weakly. Don't they? Rosia looked down and examined his fingernails. Funny. When I first met you, I thought you seemed very ordinary. I guess we'd both be wrong, wouldn't we? I wouldn't know if I was wrong, Rigel said, but I don't think you were. I am ordinary. And I suppose extraordinary things simply happen around you without your impetus, Rosia laughed quietly. Pretty much, Rigel sighed. Don't hate your family, Rosia. I know it's presumptuous of me to say so, but my father has spent his whole life hating his family. He met his own brother tonight for the first time since Mum's death, and they barely knew what to say to one another. It's satisfying, hate, but it doesn't really help anything. Neither does pretending to love when the feeling is gone, Rosia said, peering sideways at her. Is that what you do, Rigel Black? Pretend. Rigel shrugged a bit helplessly. I wouldn't know how, Rosia. Acting was never really my strong suit. Irony must be thick in the air tonight was all he said in reply. And don't call me that. It bothers you, Rigel said, raising an eyebrow. That's the second time you've said that to me tonight. Yes, Rosier exhaled sharply, it does. My friends call me Alden. We're not really friends, Rigel said. Ouch, Rosier laughed. How unflinchingly honest you are, Rigel. My last name doesn't really bother me, Rigel said. Feel free to use it. You become awfully prickly once you think someone's getting too close, Rosier said mildly. I wonder, did you make it this difficult for Pansy and Draco? Rigel vaguely recalled periods in which she flatly ignored her now friends in the vain hope that they would just go away and lose interest in her. I think I was worse, actually. Perhaps I should apologize. Don't, Rosier said dismissively, that would belittle the prize they won in outlasting you. In any case, you should never apologize for the past. Only do things differently in the future. They sat in silence, each thinking thoughts the other probably couldn't imagine. Do you think they're, done? She motioned toward the next balcony with her hand after a few minutes. Rosier took his wand out again and cancelled the noise-cancelling spell. They couldn't hear anything at all, and Rigel smiled a bit with relief. I think the music has stopped, too, Rigel said. So? Rosier said. That means the dancing is done, Rigel said, standing up, so it is safe to venture indoors once more. Rosier laughed. Am I to understand that the only reason you agreed to be my sitter was because you are afraid of being asked to dance? You make me sound like a girl, Rigel said, playing the part of a scowling boy. You are acting like a girl, Rigel, Rosier informed her cheerfully. How about this, though, he added, standing up as well, I will protect you from the hordes of ravenous female hormones in exchange for you not leaving me in my moment of vulnerability. Rigel felt compelled to point out, I've already traded a favor with Rookwood for doing that. Rosier shook his head with amused exasperation. Then be grateful that I offered to help you at all. Thank you, Rosier, she said, somewhat sarcastically. At the look he shot her, she amended her words quickly. Alden, I mean. Alden. Rosier smiled his strange little smile at her and swept open the balcony doors with a flourish. You are most welcome, Rigel Black, most welcome indeed. The lights in the ballroom were so much brighter than she remembered. People were once again making use of the full space to mill about it, having been standing in rather close quarters while the dancers took up a good third of the floor. Alden made a beeline through the crowd, and Rigel simply followed him. She was operating under the assumption that since Rosier was a good head taller than she was, he would be better equipped to find people in a crowd, and that anyone he knew well enough to seek out she had at least a moderately good chance of recognizing as well. That was how she ended up standing shoulder to shoulder with Rookwood, Selwyn, Pusey, and Bowl. No one raised an eyebrow at her presence, so she could only assume that by now everyone knew of Sirius Black's unusual presence at the New Year Gala. They talked of Quidditch for a while before the conversation turned to owls and which tests required more studying for than others. Rigel absorbed the information without really being very interested in it, though she did note with a tad bit of self-satisfaction that the two most common practicals for the potion owl seemed to be the strengthening solution and the invigoration draft. The first was almost as difficult as Snow Hit, and the second she had been brewing for Cray for months. As talk moved to idle gossip, a young man with a beautifully angled face and a haughty expression joined their group with an elegant nod to Rosier, whose answering nod was just a hair too stiff to be welcoming. The newcomer was pale, with jet black hair and eyes an icy blue. Quite an affair, Rosier, he said, gesturing with his eyes alone at the rest of the room. He held a long-stemmed glass of champagne in one hand and kept the other at his side, hidden from view by his robe sleeve. Usually, it was considered impolite to allow your hands to be hidden within your sleeves at a social event, as your host might assume you were holding your wand out of sight, but the newcomer's expression made Rigel think he simply didn't care what anyone thought of him. How kind of you to say so, Lestrange, Rosier said blandly. You know Edmund, of course, and Alice. I believe you know Lucian as well. Rookwood the haughty boy nodded shortly. Selwyn, Bowl. This is Adrian Pusey, a fourth year in Slytherin House, Rosier went on, and this is Rigel Black, second year, also in Slytherin House. Adrian, Rigel, this is Silam Lestrange, sixth year at Durmstrang. I've met your older brother, Pusey. Lestrange inclined his head to the proper degree. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He'll be pleased you've remembered him, Pusey demurred, not quite looking Lestrange in the eye. Then Lestrange set his icy gaze on her, and she thought she could well understand why the Lestrange heir was already a name spoken very carefully in some circles. Sirius had once described him as a nasty piece of work, though he'd also called him a pathetic little mama's boy, so Rigel hadn't taken his description too seriously at the time. "Well met at last, cousin," Lestrange said, voice dripping with irony. Both he and Rigel knew very well that Sirius and Bellatrix hated each other with a burning depth that most other people could only guess at. This was one of the many reasons he and Archie had never met before. "I greatly admire your uncle, Regulus, and your father. Well, I suppose it really isn't your fault." Rigel felt Rosia, who was standing next to her, tense slightly, but the only sign she gave that the barb hit home was a careful blanking of her features. "It says much of your generosity that you are able to let go the sins of the father in the case of the son, Lestrange. I can only attempt to afford you the same courtesy." Now Lestrange's was the face to go blank with hidden ire. Rigel saw Bowl frowning at her from the corner of her eye, and she faintly heard Pusey's quick intake of breath at her remark, but she was not about to apologize for defending her family's honor. She would never openly insult Lestrange, of course, but veiled contempt she could give as well as she received. If he was going to slight her father without the slightest provocation, she could without guilt make the same insinuation about his own. "A Slytherin, you say?" Lestrange glanced at Rosia with exaggerated disbelief. "No, I think not. Nothing but brash lion meat under all that shiny snakeskin, is there, Black?" Rigel tilted her head, as though considering the question. "Interesting hypothesis, Lestrange. Do you mean to suggest that the Sorting Hat may be placing people in Slytherin who don't belong there, or did you mean to infer that I personally was able to dupe one of the oldest magical artifacts of our time?" "If the first, I would be interested to know who else you suspect of having been improperly sorted into Sorlaser's noble house. If the second, I'm afraid you flatter me beyond my worth, cousin." Lestrange stared at her for a moment, in which she offered him her best innocent smile. "Well, Lestrange, do you think Rookwood belongs in Slytherin? He's awfully smart, though, so perhaps he should have been a Ravenclaw." Rookwood shifted uncomfortably next to her, but said nothing. Rigel knew she should stop, but something about Lestrange made her skin want to curl. "What about Selwyn?" Rigel pressed. "Do you think she's a true Slytherin?" "Watch it," Black Selwyn said, kohl-rimmed eyes flashing in annoyance. "Do you imagine you have trapped me by asking such questions?" Lestrange sneered at her in a way that should have made him look ugly, but didn't. "You only prove my point. A boy like you has no place in the House of Snakes." "I suppose you would know," Rigel said unconcernedly. A slightly ironic tilt to her mouth was all it took to give voice to the unspoken. "Oh wait, no, you wouldn't. Because you don't even attend Hogwarts, much less know anything about the House of Slytherin." She was being petty, admittedly, but her Uncle Sirius had come there tonight in good faith, genuinely excited to catch up with old acquaintances, and it would only take one jerk like Lestrange to ruin it for him. "Oh, very good," Lestrange said patronizingly, stepping forward so that he was now inside the loose circle their group had formed. Less distance meant he could look down on her more effectively, and speak more quietly, with a lesser chance of being overheard. "I suppose your daddy had time to teach you a few tricks after all, in between kissing up to that mudblood-loving fool Dumbledore and being a general disgrace to the name of his forefathers." "What's wrong, Black?" "Nothing to say. Maybe even you realize that your father is beyond defense." "Was I supposed to be insulted?" Rigel gazed up unflinchingly into Lestrange's cold countenance. "If you knew anything at all about Sirius Black, you'd know that he couldn't give two nuts about light and dark politics, and he would only consider your second remark the highest of compliments. In fact, I shall be sure to pass it along." "Well, pass this along, too," Lestrange hissed, stepping forward once again. He was now close enough that she could feel faint drops of spittle on her forehead when he spoke. "You tell the blood traitor that if he thinks he can make nice in our ballrooms and then go home and fuck his filthy werewolf whore and laugh with his blood traitor boyfriend and that mudblood bitch, well, some of us would savor the chance to correct his thinking." Rigel didn't hear Rosia's quietly forceful admonishment or see Bowl subtly restrain Pusey from stepping in. All she could hear were the words werewolf whore and mudblood bitch echoing like gunshots in her head. All she could see was Silam Lestrange's smug, conceited face, and all she could feel was that condescending jerk's stupid, pure-blooded spit on her face. "Get him away from me," she screamed internally. Her magic answered her call faster than she could comprehend, much less regret. It was coursing through her body one moment, and the next it was expelled forcefully from her chest. Lestrange, who was at that point mere inches in front of her, caught the full brunt of it. The magic slammed into his torso, and the only thing more satisfying than seeing him literally scoot backwards on his heels a good 5 feet was seeing the expression of complete shock on his face as it happened. The magic didn't knock him down, it didn't break a rib or cause tiny cuts to appear all over his body. He looked no worse for wear at all, and not even a single drop of champagne had spilled from his glass. The magic did no more or less than shoot him back to the exact same spot he had occupied when he first walked up to their circle, and that, more than anything, satisfied Rigel. It made exactly the right point, without leaving him anything to put up a fuss about and get she and Sirius thrown out for. There was a moment of complete silence, as the other 5 stared between Rigel and Lestrange, obviously at a loss for what to do. They couldn't defend Rigel's actions without seeming to sympathize with blood traitors, even though Lestrange had definitely crossed an invisible line when he descended into open mudslinging and poorly veiled threats. They also couldn't support Lestrange without looking like just as much of an ass as he did, even if any of them had been inclined to support Lestrange. Judging by the carefully controlled anger on more than one face, Rigel wouldn't bet that Lestrange had made any lasting friendships that night by his words to her. Rigel was the first to break the silence, or perhaps she was the only one who could. "Excuse me, friends, but I must go and seek out Draco before he accuses me of avoiding him. Good evening." She turned and walked away without glancing back, weaving through the crowd quickly to escape the eyes that followed her departure wordlessly. She was still extremely upset about what Lestrange had said, but the further she moved away from the situation, the less she was inclined to dwell on it. It had been ugly and unnecessary, yes, but it was dealt with, so it was time to let it go as best she could. After all, if she did nothing but brood over all the petty, cruel people in the world, she wouldn't have time to sleep. Rigel left the ballroom and followed a house elf to what was being used as the gentleman's restroom that night. She wet Archie's handkerchief in the sink and began wiping her face as thoroughly as she could without rubbing it raw. She may have been in the process of forgetting Lestrange's words, but she'd be damned if she was going to walk around with his slimy DNA on her skin all night. There came a knock at the door, just 2 polite raps, and Rigel quickly patted her face dry before opening the door with a murmured apology. "Hello again, nephew." Rigel looked up into the face of Regulus Black, and bowed slightly. "Uncle. I trust your evening has been pleasant." "Diverting, at least," Regulus said. He gazed at her for a moment, then said, "Were you crying, boy?" Rigel blinked, startled, then realized what her red and freshly scrubbed face, coupled with the fact that she was locked in the bathroom, must look like to the other man. "No, uncle," she said, mouth tilting wryly, "I was unfortunate enough to come into contact with a substance of questionable sanitary value, and merely sought to remove it before danger of infection set in." "Pray tell, what sort of substance could you have possibly encountered at Rosier Mansion that would cause you hygienic apprehension?" Regulus asked with a lifted brow. "Saliva," Rigel said sardonically, from the mouth of an unwashed Lestrange. "Not that there's anything wrong with Lestrange," she added belatedly, having forgotten who she was talking to in light of her disgust at the entire situation. "I'm sure not all of them are, well." She peered up at Regulus to see if he was offended by her less than complimentary words about a pure-blooded family he probably mingled with often. She nearly flinched at the look of cold anger upon his visage. This was a man much more frightening than Silam Lestrange. "And how, exactly, did Lestrange spit end up on the face of the Black Air?" Regulus demanded. His grey eyes looked like storm clouds, his face pinched with ire. Rigel backtracked quickly. "It does not matter, uncle. I have taken care of it." "You?" Regulus sneered. Rigel simply nodded. "Yes, me. We have settled our differences, and the only thing remaining was for me to prevent the onset of rabies. As you can see, that has been accomplished as well, so the matter is concluded to my satisfaction." "And to your father's?" Regulus countered coldly. "Sirius does not need to know of this incident," Rigel said, just as coldly. "I do not like to trouble my father needlessly." "When the family heir allows himself to be spat upon," Regulus hissed, "it is past time for the family head to be troubled." "I can only assume you think so low of me because you do not know me," Uncle Rigel said sharply, her mood still a little rough from the last half hour of her evening, but let me assure you that when I tell you I have handled something, it is handled. Regulus drew himself up and looked down at her with detached calculation. So you may claim, he said eventually, but know that if I hear it whispered among my colleagues that the Black heir is weak, I will not stand idly by. The House of Black cannot afford another weak family head, and if I think for a moment that you are unfit for the responsibility, I will see to it that it is never yours to bear. I await your judgment then, Uncle Rigel said, bowing once more. Please excuse me. She ventured back into the ballroom, weary beyond belief at the night that was somehow still not over. Perhaps it had been a mistake to come here. Perhaps she had been a fool. She caught sight of platinum blonde hair through a gap in the crowd, and felt her spirits lift. The night was not finished yet, and she had to find her friends once more. She pursued the flash of blonde hair through the crowd, until she came face to face with its owner. It was Mrs. Malfoy, and she smiled down at Rigel with serenity that was like a balm on her agitated nerves. Rigel. We've hardly seen you all night, Narcissa said. She touched Rigel's shoulder lightly and said, come this way. Lucius and Draco are with Mr. Riddle's party. Rigel was not at all sure she wanted to see Riddle again that night, but it would be both churlish and revealing to break away from Mrs. Malfoy now. So she allowed the elegant lady to guide her through the crowd, until they came to the very center of the ballroom, where a large group of people stood conversing. The group was so large in fact that there seemed to be several conversations going on inside of it, with different people participating to varying degrees in each. Mr. Riddle stood between Mr. Malfoy and Mr. Parkinson. Beside Mr. Parkinson was a woman Rigel recognized easily from the Black family tapestry as Bellatrix Lestrange. She was beautiful in a wild, untamed sort of way, but Rigel privately thought Narcissa to be the fairer of the two sisters. Next to Mrs. Lestrange stood two men who must have been brothers, both incredibly tall and muscular, with dark, watchful countenances. They would be Rodolphus and Robaston Lestrange, Rigel presumed. Next to the Lestrange brothers stood Lord and Lady Rosier. There were many others in the group she didn't recognize, as well. Mrs. Malfoy stepped into place between her husband and her son, who stood at Mr. Malfoy's right hand. Draco turned to make room for his mother and smiled when he spotted Rigel following behind her. There you are. Pansy is monstrously cross with you, Draco informed her slyly, motioning her to come and stand between him and a heavyset wizard she could only vaguely remember meeting before. Either Crabbe or Goyle Sr., she thought. I shall find a suitably degrading way to beg her forgiveness, Rigel said, smiling a bit. Having a pleasant time, Draco? I suppose, Draco said. Nothing terribly exciting has happened, but now that you're here, I expect that will change rather abruptly. Rigel put a hand to her heart in mock vexation. It's as though you want strange things to happen around me, Draco. Haven't I told you they aren't my mother? An unusually strident voice cut across all the light-hearted conversation in the immediate vicinity. Several heads turned watch as the Lestranger grasped at his mother's elbow insistently. Bellatrix Lestrange turned her head slowly, having been in the middle of a conversation with Mr. Parkinson when her son interrupted. She gazed at the pale, haughty-faced boy for a good 10 seconds in silence before saying, Yes, Xylem. What is so important that you must discuss it with me now? Her eyes flicked sharply toward the other people in the group, several of whom were making no pretense of ignoring the interaction. Xylem Lestrange glanced around the circle dismissively, not appearing to even notice the dangerous looks he was being given for his impertinence. The most monstrously unforgivable thing has. The boy broke off and did a double take, whirling his head to stare straight at Rigel. You. Good evening, Lestrange, Rigel said, a polite smile on her face. The boy's eyes narrowed and his pale face flushed an unhealthy puce, and then he whirled away and disappeared into the crowd without any explanation whatsoever. There was an awkward moment of silence as many of the adults turned questioning faces toward Rigel, and Draco muttered under his breath, Not your fault. Yeah, right. Well, what have we here? Bellatrix Lestrange was eyeing Rigel like a venomous spider might eye an unfamiliar species of fruit fly it had caught in its web. Little serious whelp, aren't you? Rigel bowed deeply. Good evening, Lady Lestrange. I am indeed Rigel Black. It is a pleasure to meet you. A twisted smile made its way onto Bellatrix's doll-like face. Charmed, I'm sure. Do tell me what you have done to my son, child. I admit I have yet to devise such an efficient way of getting rid of him. Rigel thought that was a perfectly awful thing to say about your own child, no matter how much of a jerk he was, but she simply blinked once and said, I'm afraid I don't know, my lady. We have only met briefly before this moment. Let me know when you figure it out, then Bellatrix said, that creepy smile still playing about her mouth. Rigel inclined her head, and was grateful when Mrs. Lestrange dismissed her to resume her conversation with Mr. Parkinson. Most of the others picked back up on their own conversations, and if it weren't for Riddle's curious gaze and Draco's knowing smirk, she could almost pretend the brief scene hadn't occurred. Mr. Malfoy's face was unreadable as he said, Draco, why don't you and Rigel go and look for your friend, Miss Parkinson? I doubt you shall truly enjoy your New Year's Eve at my side. Draco nodded respectfully, yes, father. Let's go, Rigel. Rigel was more than happy to escape, and gave Mr. Malfoy mental thanks for enabling her retreat. They soon found Pansy talking to Blaise and standing with her mother, who was engaged in a lively discussion with Lady Zabinai. Draco Pansy smiled, welcoming him over with a fond pat on the elbow. We thought you'd be embroiled in politics with your father all evening, didn't we, Blaise? Indeed, Blaise said, smiling wryly. Hello again, Rigel. Hello, Blaise. Rigel said, hi Pansy. Pansy sniffed and looked in another direction. Right. Pansy, goddess of my heart, pearl of the morning, Rigel tried. Pansy still gazed resolutely away from her. Mrs. Parkinson paused in her conversation with Mrs. Zabinai to listen with growing amusement. Pansy, talk to me, please. I'm sorry to have left so pure a flower in the midst of her blossoming springtime to the protection of another, but you must understand I would never have abandoned you if the situation were not of the utmost necessity. Situation? Pansy prompted, examining her silk gloves with an air of disinterest. Yes, Rigel said, casting about for ideas, a quest was entrusted to me by one you hold in high esteem. I knew that to turn him down would be to let you down as well, and so I was caught in a most ignoble predicament, with shame on either side of my choice. That is why I sent friend Rookwood in my stead, that the chivalrous behavior on my part might at least be lessened to a tolerable degree. Edmund has mentioned this quest to me, Pansy said, sniffing, and in my understanding it was given to you after you already decided to stand me up. You promised me the third dance, Rigel. Promised. So I did, Rigel said, dropping pretense with a sigh, but you must admit that promise was extracted from me under duress. I hardly consider your father's mere presence to be duress, Pansy said, pursing her lips but at least deigning to look at Rigel at last. You would if you knew him, Rigel assured her. Can't you just allow me to make it up to you, Pan? Please? Pansy tilted her head consideringly. I suppose you could grant me 2 dances at the next ball. At Rigel's poorly suppressed look of unease, Pansy burst into laughter. I'm kidding, Rigel, do you believe me to be so unperceptive? Truly, I wasn't even very cross. I rather expected you to duck out from how reluctant you were to agree to the dance, and sending Edmund in your place was very thoughtful. Rigel blinked, and then smiled in relief. I admit you had me going, Pansy. Pansy smiled winsomely at her. Of course I did, Rigel. I'm a woman. At that, Mrs. Parkinson and Mrs. Zabinai both could contain their amusement no longer. Rose Parkinson dissolved into her light, bell-like laughter, and Mrs. Zabinai chuckled softly in her smooth, naturally seductive voice. The 3 pure-blooded females in the group shared a conspiratorial look, and both Draco and Blaise looked like they were fighting the temptation to back away slowly. And how is your winter break, Rigel? Rose Parkinson asked eventually. Rigel smiled easily. Quite productive, Lady Parkinson. So in Rigel speak, Draco translated helpfully, that means he's been brewing at least 6 potions a day. 6. How the youth today exaggerates, Mrs. Zabinai said, smiling. Draco glanced at Rigel wryly, but didn't contradict the beautiful older lady. If Rigel had to describe Mrs. Zabinai, she would have to say that she was every inch as beautiful as Bellatrix Lestrange, and gave off the same dangerous air with the way she held herself. But there was something sharp in Bellatrix Lestrange that was soft in Lady Zabinai. Rigel chatted with Blaise, Pansy, and Draco for a little while, but soon after Sirius found her. There you are, Sport. Sirius clapped a hand on Rigel's shoulder and smiled around at the others. Sorry to pull you away, but it's 25 till midnight. Rigel nodded her understanding. It was good seeing you all. Good evening, Lady Parkinson, Lady Zabinai. Bye Draco, Pansy, Blaze. See you in school. You're leaving. Draco said with slight dismay, the party doesn't end until 1. Yes, Rigel said. It was tradition for the blacks to be with the Potters on the stroke of midnight. I had a wonderful time, though. Good night. Her friends said their farewells, and she and Sirius quickly made their way toward the ballroom doors. The exit apparition point was in a different room than the entering apparition point, just off the hallway where the guest restrooms were located, so they didn't have to climb the ridiculously long staircase again. Sirius said he'd already made their excuses to Lord and Lady Rosier, thanked them for their hospitality, etc., so all that was left to do was go. Before they reached the apparition room, however, a voice from behind them in the hallway called them back. Wait, Lord Black, it was Alden Rosier hurrying toward them. My apologies, but may I speak to Rigel for a short moment before you leave? Sirius turned questioning eyes on Rigel, who nodded slightly. Her uncle checked his watch, then said, 5 minutes. He went on ahead. What is it, Alden? Rigel asked. Rosier smiled briefly, then his face grew serious. Listen, Lestrange is an ass. I'm sorry that happened in my family's ballroom. I've already forgotten it, Rigel said. Well, he hasn't, Rosier said. Guys like Lestrange are more than willing to hold a grudge for even the pettiest of perceived slights, and you showed him up proper, in a way he can't even prove since it was obvious you didn't even have your wand out. Rigel opened her mouth, but Rosier shook his head. I don't want to know how you did it, or if someone else did it for you. What matters is that Lestrange looked like a fool, and he knows it. Just, be careful, all right? Try to avoid him from now on, and watch your back around any of his relatives. Rigel nodded, thank you for the warning. I will be careful. Sure you will. Alden smiled ruefully, something like worry clouding his eerie golden eyes. Happy New Year, Rigel. Rigel smiled back, no trace of concern revealed on her own face despite all that had happened since 8 o'clock that evening. Truly, the night had seemed like a lifetime, and to you, Alden. She gave one last nod, then turned and hurried after Sirius. They still had 15 minutes, but she wanted to have a moment to switch back with Archie before the clock struck 12. -0. HP. -0. The rest of winter break passed too slowly for Harry. She had finished her homework ages ago, it seemed, and even all her extracurricular studies couldn't keep her occupied for long. It was therefore with relief that she stowed away her green contacts and boarded the train as Rigel Black almost 2 weeks after the start of the new year. About an hour out from London, however, Rigel began feeling strange. She developed a mild headache, which was nothing unusual for her, except that she hadn't been reading in dim lighting that day. She thought perhaps she was dehydrated, and bought a water off the trolley, but the headache persisted. A short time after that, she felt herself growing unaccountably fatigued. Rigel's eyelids began to droop, and before she knew it she had fallen asleep in her seat, head pillowed on the armrest between her chair and Draco's. Oh. HP. Oh. Draco's POV. Draco looked down at the head of short black curls resting innocently on his armrest and wondered if anyone else realized how completely incongruous Rigel Black's appearance was with his true nature. Rigel Black was, to be blunt, fragile-looking. Elegant features ran in many pure-blooded lines, but Rigel's face was just plain delicate. Before Rigel had joined the Quidditch team, Draco would have guessed that his pale skin was a result of the obnoxious amount of time Rigel spent cooped up in the dungeon brewing. Now, however, he knew that Rigel simply didn't tan. Ever. Somehow, he could spend hours in the sun flying and return indoors just as ghost-like as he'd left. His almost sickly appearance when compared with the other boys in their year, however, didn't have anything to do with Rigel Black's ability, mental or physical. He kept up easily in Flint's training sessions and had his own exercise regimen on top of that, one which Draco meant to attend more than a couple of times a week, but never seemed to wake up in time for. He was also, quite possibly, the smartest person Draco knew. Well, that wasn't quite true, Draco corrected himself as he turned his gaze from the top of Rigel's head to the train window. It wasn't that Rigel was smarter than Draco was, exactly. In class Rigel learned at the same pace he and Pansy did, and while neither he nor Pansy were what you'd call mediocre in the intelligence department, they weren't geniuses either. Draco was pretty sure Rigel didn't only pretend to learn slowly to make himself more ordinary seeming, though he was sure Rigel did other things to achieve that effect, so that meant Rigel wasn't inherently smarter than other people. He just apparently lacked the ability to not do 5 things at once. Draco didn't think he'd ever seen Rigel listen to a lecture without also reading a different book under his desk. The exception to this rule was McGonagall's class, because McGonagall wouldn't allow it, and Snape's, because Rigel loved Snape's classes. Still, he had taken a peek at Rigel's notes during Transfiguration once or twice, and always they looked more like an essay for another class than notes usually did. If someone had told him how much Rigel could learn over the course of a month without telling him anything else about the boy, Draco would have probably assumed he had access to a time turner. Once you actually paid attention to what Rigel did with his time, however, it became clear that if Rigel had access to a time turner, he'd have graduated Hogwarts already and be halfway to solving Merlinian arithmancy. He was just that alarmingly efficient. So his short stature and delicate features were little indication of the strength of Rigel's character, and yet, Draco sometimes couldn't entirely look past them. Like now, with Rigel having fallen asleep without warning and seemingly without even realizing it. He looked the picture of vulnerability. Before meeting Rigel Black, Draco would have said he was the type to be unmoved by displays of weakness, but somehow fragility wasn't a weakness in Rigel, it was a deception. One Draco himself was not entirely above falling for, he admitted quietly to himself. How often had he and Pansy attempted to shield Rigel, to protect him and defend him from those who meant him harm, only to discover that while Rigel would allow them to help if he felt like it, he didn't need them to. He could apparently handle his enemies just as well without them. And wasn't that odd? Rigel had more enemies than Draco did, and Draco was the son of Lucius Malfoy, one of the most feared, and therefore one of the most easily hated, men in Wizarding Britain. Like that night at Lord Riddle's gala. Draco had asked around discreetly, via letter writing, which he absolutely detested, but no one knew what would make Lestrange react so peculiarly to Rigel simply greeting the boy. Eventually Adrian Pusey had admitted to witnessing something that might explain the scene Draco described, but he wouldn't say what for fear of upsetting, not Lestrange, but Rigel. Draco could only shake his head in complete bemusement when his father had asked him later what Rigel's history with Lestrange was. Lucius Malfoy had not been happy with his son's ignorance, but Draco wasn't exactly tickled with his father right then either, so he would put off reporting to him until he really felt like it. Draco scowled at the sprawling English countryside as thoughts of his father slowly replaced thoughts of his friend. Lucius was doing that patently annoying thing again where he handed out vaguely cryptic and purposely maddening hints of something he wouldn't explain, and then expected Draco to do something with them. The only thing Draco had figured out from his father's mostly indecipherable advice thus far was that Lucius knew something vital about the strange attacks on Longbottom and that Ravenclaw girl. He hadn't said why, or even how, but when Draco brought up his concern, he had said that Draco had nothing to worry about. The utter confidence with which his father had spoken sent chills up Draco's spine even now. No one could be sure about something like that unless they were the ones behind it, but if his father was behind it he wouldn't be asking Draco so many questions about what was going on. That meant that either A, Lucius was pretending to confidence for his son's sake, or B, someone in whom Lucius had complete confidence was behind the attacks. If the former, Draco was worried. If a Malfoy had to fake confidence in something, things could not be at all going the way they were supposed to go. If the latter, Draco was, frankly, worried. That sounded a little too much like the sleeping sickness for Draco's comfort, considering he'd almost died because of that sickness. In fact, he had almost died less than a week after his father had sounded supremely confident in the interview he gave to the Prophet. Draco scowled even harder at the countryside. All in all, the situation was not looking good. If you burn a hole through the glass by glaring at it, I hope you'll take responsibility for what the wind will do to my hair, Pansy said from her seat facing him. She was between Millicent, who was reading her charms textbook, and Blaise, who was having a conversation with Theo about Latin-based versus rune-based magic. Draco changed his expression to one of fond amusement as he turned his gaze from the window to his other best friend, and wasn't that a strange thought? Best friends with a girl. I could easily take such responsibility, he said teasingly, but I'm not sure how that would help your hair. Pansy laughed, and the world suddenly didn't seem as ugly as it had from the disgruntled corner of his thoughts. Fair point. I shall have to distract you from your unhappy thoughts, then, if my appearance is to be saved from certain ruin. Your presence alone is diversion enough, Draco said, quirking a smile at her. Pansy truly was a gem. Patient and kind, she was sure to be the social catch of their year when she matured. Draco knew his parents were already looking subtly for signs of a prospective match, and honestly, it wouldn't be bad, he thought. They were already friends, and even if some part of him felt that that was all they'd ever be, it was still more than a lot of people had in a marriage. She was smart, and bound to be pretty if the pictures he'd seen of her grandmother, whose coloring she took after, were anything to judge by. Pure-blooded girls weren't exactly thick on the ground in their generation, and Draco sincerely believed he could do a lot worse than Pansy Parkinson as a wife. Draco. Are you quite done zoning out? Pansy gazed at him with amusement, and Draco felt a bit sheepish for how far his thoughts had carried him. He didn't need to worry about stuff like that for several years at least. Shaking himself out of the inane mental trench he seemed to have been digging, Draco concentrated on the present. The future could always wait. Diversion enough indeed, Pansy said, her eyes bright with secret laughter. What a fibber you are, Drake. Drake. Draco raised an eyebrow. That one's new. Well, Pansy said, cheeks turning the slightest bit pink, we all seem to have different nicknames for one another, but I didn't have a different one for you. Do we? Draco said, surprised. You haven't noticed? Boys, Pansy said, as though that one word were explanation enough. You call me Pans sometimes, but Rigel just calls me Pan. You call Rigel Rye sometimes, and he occasionally calls you Dre. So now I'm calling you Drake. Draco smiled softly. I like it. What will you call Rigel, though? I'm not sure, Pansy frowned. Rye is really the only good nickname for Rigel, and I don't want to do a variation on Archerus, because he really doesn't seem to like his first name much. His father uses it, Draco pointed out, though sometimes Rigel refers to his father by his first name as well, so maybe it's an inside joke. Yes, isn't that odd? Pansy remarked. Actually, there's something odd about Rigel's entire relationship with his father, don't you think? Draco leaned over to get a look at Rigel's face, to make sure it was still relaxed with genuine sleep before answering. I agree. Some of the things Black says don't really make sense. At least not in relation to the Rigel we know. It's like he's trying to be an entire different person when he's with his father, Blaze interjected. His expression was that of someone explaining something obvious. Draco frowned, a bit put out that Blaze thought he knew Rigel better than they did. You weren't even there when we met his father at the station. I observed Rigel with his father at the gala, Blaze said easily. What interaction I witnessed was brief, but rather obvious. Besides that, there's he and his father's correspondence. His father writes as though Rigel is a completely different person than he is, and Rigel responds as if he's the imaginary person his father thinks he is. You read his mail? Draco scowled. Why would either of them do that? Pansy asked, looking perplexed. Is it some kind of code? I suspected that at first, but after seeing them at the gala it became clear to me that it was a regular facet of their relationship, Blaze said. His voice was detached, almost clinical, but there was something concerned in his eyes as he spoke that made Draco think Blaze probably cared more about other people than he liked to let on. Blaze seemed to visibly hesitate before going on to say, carefully, it also seemed to me that only one of them was aware that anything about the situation was odd. Millicent, who had stopped reading her book some time ago to listen in, looked completely shocked. You think that Rigel's father believes him to be something he is not, and that Rigel completely supports and even actively encourages this mistaken belief. That is beyond absurd. No one can pretend to be something they aren't for their entire life. Well, there's another alternative, Blaze said, looking grim, but you aren't going to like it. He was looking at Draco in particular as he said it, so Draco steeled himself not to react as he asked, what is that? The other alternative is that it isn't Sirius Black who Rigel is lying to about who he is, Blaze said, almost apologetically. The notion was an obvious one, but that didn't stop it from hitting Draco like a punch to the gut. Not that he'd ever been punched in the gut, but some things one can imagine without experiencing them. Still, I don't believe that, Draco said firmly. Neither do I, Pansy said flatly. Blaze inclined his head. Nor I personally. I think that Rigel's father is the one being lied to, but I felt compelled to list all the possibilities, for completeness sake. Sometimes Draco wished Blaze paid a little less homage to completeness and more to general sensibilities, but many things, like Rigel's selective obliviousness and Blaze's exacting need for correctness, were beyond his ability to wish away. So, either way that leaves us with Rigel being an incredibly long-term liar for no apparent reason, Theo said, worrying his bottom lip with his teeth. I mean, why would he do that to his own father? It's kind of cold. I just never pictured Rigel like that. You think Rigel is lying to his father to manipulate or hurt him? Blaze shook his head slowly. No, it is entirely the other way around. What do you mean? Pansy prompted. Please explain if you are going to say things like that, Blaze. Yes, of course. Blaze inclined his head gracefully. I was merely collecting my thoughts. We know that the person Rigel is with us is not the person he is with his father. Let us compare the two. We see Rigel as someone rather low-key in his day-to-day existence. He studies more than most people would consider reasonable, he enjoys potions more than any of us will probably ever understand, and he rarely expresses himself openly or without considerable prompting by others. Yes. They all nodded with more or less general agreement. Draco and Pansy have observed his interactions with his father more closely than I have, Blaze said, but I admit to glancing over his letters when he opens them at the breakfast table, and to occasionally distracting him while he writes his replies so that I can skim over those as well. Blaze. That's a bit much even for us, Millicent protested with exasperation. And I have discovered several things about the person Rigel pretends to be for his father's benefit, Blaze went on, ignoring the slightly censorious looks he was getting from the four of them. That boy is cheerful, engaging, and impertinent. That boy enjoys playing pranks and openly teasing his friends and family. That boy is always upbeat and rarely complains about anything. He is more interested in discussing Quidditch than academics, and even when he is being serious, that boy is more earnest than he is careful. The second years exchanged looks that were worried, bewildered, and surprised. That boy sounds a lot like how my mother described Sirius Black as a child, Pansy said slowly. Draco nodded as he came to the same conclusion. James Potter, too. It sounds just like how Mother described the Marauders when they were in school. Theo spoke up as well. Actually, that made-up kid kind of sounds like what I expected the Black Heir to be like. Before I met him, I mean, and before he was sorted into Slytherin, obviously. I thought he would be a happy-go-lucky prankster, or else an amateur smooth talker like his father. He was sort of like that, the very first night, Pansy said, eyes distant as she tried to remember their first feast together. I remember thinking he was a lot like his father, only now I don't think that about Rigel at all. Maybe he was still so used to pretending that he hadn't relaxed yet, Millicent said. She paused, then added, this is the strangest conversation I've ever had about someone behind their back. Draco felt a tiny stab of guilt at those words, but he ignored them. Rigel wouldn't actually care that they were talking about him behind his back. Draco could almost picture the expression of amusement Rigel would wear as he listened to them all try to figure him out, even, but it still felt a little tiny bit rude to be dissecting his life like this. Ah, well. Secrets were meant to be ferreted out, after all, and besides that they were friends. They just wanted to know, not blackmail him or anything. Back to what you said earlier, though, Pansy said, looking at Blaze, you implied that Rigel is pretending for his father's sake, is that right? You think that we're not the only ones who expected Sirius Black's son to be happy and mischievous and all of that, don't you, Blaze? You think Sirius Black expected those things from his son, too, and Rigel goes through these elaborate motions so that he doesn't disappoint him. Blaze inclined his head slowly. That is one possible theory, yes. But parents don't want their children to lie to them, Millicent protested, they want them to be happy. Black thinks his son is happy, Blaze said, shrugging. Who says Rigel isn't happy? Draco demanded. Yes, who says I'm not happy? Draco's head jerked down to see Rigel slowly pushing up from the armrest. No one spoke as their friend rubbed one hand across his eyes and covered his mouth with the other as a small yawn escaped him. Rigel sat up in his seat and turned his head to look at them all. His cheeks were flushed from sleep, and his eyes were still a bit tired looking, but his voice was calm and even as he said, I'm very happy. Rigel, Pansy started, an apology clear in her voice and facial expression. Rigel waved a hand negligently at her. It's okay, Pan, I don't care. I only heard a little of it anyway, but you all should know that it's not a question of whether I'm happy or not, but rather a question of what makes my dad happy. I'm happy either way, so pretending to be the son he wants doesn't hurt me at all and pleases him a great deal. Win-win. Draco was not at all sure that was true. How could such a thing not hurt Rigel? If your father thought you were something you weren't, then he'd be proud of something that didn't exist. Every interaction, every gesture of approval and affection would be meaningless. Draco couldn't think of anything that would be more painful than willingly diverting his own father's love onto something else, something that wasn't even real. And yet, Rigel didn't even see anything wrong with it. Most of the time, Rigel's inside didn't seem to mesh with his outside at all, but at moments like this, everything about Rigel seemed as fragile as fairy glass. His world just didn't make sense to Draco. Rigel's life was so completely unstable. His actions contradicted with his other actions, and adding in his words only made things even worse. In summation, his own life had made significantly more sense before he met Rigel Black, but on the other hand, he watched Rigel easily distract Millicent with a question about the herbology assignment that Draco thought it highly unlikely Rigel hadn't already completed. On the other hand, life had been significantly less interesting then, too. Oh. HP. Oh. Regular POV. By the time Rigel got off the train, she really wasn't feeling well. Her headache had disappeared for a while after her nap, but had come back with a vengeance during the last half hour of the trip. Her muscles were aching in her back and thighs, and her stomach was cramping something fierce. She was worried she might have caught some kind of bug over break. She had been in contact with Merlin knows how many people between her frequent trips through Diagon and Nocturne Alley and the New Year's Eve party. All she wanted to do was sleep, but she was pretty sure you couldn't skip the welcoming feast just because you wanted to. So she sat at the Slytherin table with her yearmates, trying not to concentrate on how the noise was making her headache progress quickly toward migraine status. "Are you all right, Rigel?" Pansy said at one point, leaning in to speak quietly to her. "I'm really sorry you had to listen to us talking about you like that. It wasn't very discreet of us, with you being right there. Are you cross?" Rigel summoned a smile for Pansy. "No, Pan, I'm not upset with you. I just have a bit of a headache." Pansy's relief was instantly replaced by concern. "Do you want me to fetch a headache potion from Madame Pomfrey?" Rigel gave her an amused look. Pansy sent her an exasperated one back. I know, you're perfectly capable of brewing your own headache potion, but surely you don't want to have to brew one while having a headache." Rigel smiled. "Thanks, Pansy, but I've got a few already made in my kit. I'll take one when we get back to the common room." Pansy patted her arm gently. "Very well, then. If you need anything, though, please ask." "It's really not that bad," Rigel said reassuringly. When Pansy turned to answer a question Theo asked her from her left side, Rigel rubbed at her temple agitatedly. She drank as much water as her cramping stomach would allow, then, when she felt that she had surely stayed long enough to be polite, she excused herself as discreetly as possible. Draco stood along with her. "You don't have to, Draco," she said distractedly. "Enjoy the feast." Draco took her elbow, as though he knew she was feeling worse than she acted, and walked with her slowly to the doors. "You're not supposed to go wandering alone, remember? None of us are. It's only the 5th time I've told you that. You never listen." "I'm listening right now," Rigel said tiredly as they took the steps down to the dungeons. "Then you never remember listening when the time comes to actually act on the information you were supposed to be hearing," Draco said, no small amount of annoyance coloring his voice. "I know you told Pansy you have a headache, but you've been flushed since you woke up on the train. And you were holding your stomach earlier under the table where you thought no one would see. What's wrong?" Rigel had to laugh a bit at that. "You are too observant for your own good, Dre. I am exactly as observant as I need to be to stay ahead of your ridiculous pretenses," Draco said, "many of which appear to be all too automatic for you at this point, if I may say so." "I'd rather you just think it," Rigel said. She paused to yawn, "but I suppose it would be a feat beyond my meager capabilities to actively prevent Draco Malfoy from speaking his mind, so, sure. Go ahead and say so." "Ha," Draco said, that was so funny I almost forgot that you never answered my question. Oh, wait, no I didn't. What's wrong, Rigel? Rigel grimaced, I'm not sure. My stomach hurts, my muscles ache, I have a headache, and I'm more tired than I should be considering I've done nothing but sit on a train all day on more than 7 hours of sleep. So you're sick? Draco made Rigel stop for a moment so he could put his hand on her forehead. You're a bit warm, but it could just be because you're tired. We should go to the hospital wing. You know I hate healers, Rigel said, starting toward the common room again. I don't think you hate anything, Draco said. You know I really dislike going to see healers, Rigel corrected herself with a sigh. So you've said. Draco glanced at her sidelong, but so far no reasoning that makes any sense has been offered to back that statement up. Rigel said disinterestedly. If it gets worse, I'm getting Snape, Draco said firmly. Sure, Rigel said, smiling her thanks at her blonde friend, it's probably nothing, though. I hardly ever get sick, and it doesn't last long when I do. So in other words your immune system is way overdue for a reality check, Draco drawled. Rigel just shook her head. They arrived at the common room entrance and stopped. Draco looked at Rigel and Rigel looked at Draco. Do you? No. Well, damn, Draco said, we really thought this one through. Rigel laughed a bit. They really were idiots, walking all the way down there without knowing the new term's password. Then again. Hey, Draco, Rigel said casually, do you want to know a secret? Draco stared at her for a beat. I can't believe you just said that. We're Slytherins, Rigel. I suppose tomorrow you'll ask a Ravenclaw if he wants to read a book. Is that a yes? Rigel said, smiling slyly. For Sorlaser's sake, you'd better tell me, Draco huffed, or I shall decry you to all and sundry as a complete tease. Rigel laughed softly, okay, but don't tell anyone. Besides Pansy, I mean. Given, Draco agreed quickly. Rigel turned to the common room wall and twisted her thoughts in the way she had grown accustomed to doing around her uncle's pets. Open, she hissed quietly. The wall slid open at once, and Draco sucked in a surprised breath beside her. He hurried her into the common room and checked it for occupants before turning and saying softly, there's a secondary password for the common room in Parseltongue. That's brilliant, Rigel. How did you figure it out? Wait, Draco made a face, it's not something obvious, like Sorlaser, is it? Worse, Rigel said, chuckling softly, it's open. Draco snorted incredulously, you're joking. I guess it wouldn't matter, since no one else would even understand, but, really? That's so. I know, Rigel said, still smiling, I could barely believe it when Puce's snake told me. Maybe Slytherin figured it was so obvious none of his descendants would think of it. A double bluff, of a sort. Maybe. Draco tossed a glance at Sorlaser Slytherin's portrait, but he wasn't there at the moment. Either way, that is seriously cool. How long have you been able to do that? Rigel shrugged. Puce's snake told me in November, but this is the first time I've used it. Draco's face was alight with pleased satisfaction. Thank you, Rigel. For telling me one of your secrets. It was either that or stand outside and wait for a prefect, Rigel joked. Her smile faded a bit and she added, most of the time I don't really mean to keep secrets from you, Draco. I just forget I have them, until something like this reminds me. Draco looked resigned. I'm not going to ask how you can forget about a secret that is that useful, because, it's you. So tonight I'm just glad you told me. Rigel huffed once more with amusement, and then started toward their dormitory. Well, I'm for bed. You napped on the train, Draco said, a frown creeping back onto his face. I'm just a little tired, Draco, Rigel said, opening the door and making a beeline for her bed. It's nothing to worry about. Say what you want, Rigel, Draco said, sitting on his trunk to unlace his shoes. I'm going to keep an eye on you anyway. That, Rigel reflected as she kicked off her own shoes and curled up on top of her comforter, seemed to be a rather common theme in their friendship. Oh. HP. Oh. Rigel woke several times that night, and each time she tried to drink as much water as she could stomach to get her stubborn migraine, which had persisted despite the headache potion, to go away. Finally, at about 3 in the morning, her bladder rebelled and Rigel had no choice but to give in to its demands, prying her aching muscles from her soft bed and moving as quietly as she could to the bathroom she and Draco usually shared, Theo and Blaze having claimed the other for their own. She locked the door automatically behind her, undid Archie's belt with practiced ease, and froze, staring in part disbelief, part horror at the rust-colored stain on her undergarments. Taking a deep breath, Rigel shut the pants entirely off and sat down on the toilet to think while she relieved her bladder. She noted that it didn't hurt to do so, and felt considerably relieved. No pain removed most of the more terrible medical possibilities she'd read about in Archie's healer textbooks. Well, she couldn't say no pain, Rigel thought disgruntledly, after all her lower abdominals were still cramping something. Oh. She gave in to self-disgust and smacked herself smartly on the forehead. I am such an idiot, she whispered to herself. Really, how silly could she be? She had known this would happen since she was 9. Lily believed in early instruction, and had given her daughter several books on the subject of female adolescence. Menstruation was one of the things that had stood out the most under mandatory pubescent experiences, but somehow Rigel hadn't thought it would be so sudden. She knew what it felt like to bleed from a cut or scrape, so she'd somehow expected it to feel like that. But it hadn't. She now knew that the cramps had been the warning, but she hadn't felt the actual blood leaving her at all. That was actually kind of scary, she thought uneasily. What if she bled to death in her sleep without noticing? Rigel sighed, shaking the ridiculous thought aside. Every girl in the world went through the exact same thing, and she rather doubted many of them bled to death in their sleep. Someone would have said something, surely. Well, now that she knew what it was, she just had to deal with it. Rigel wished she had been better prepared for this. She knew there was a potion witches took that stopped the cramps, but she didn't have any ready-made in her kit. She also didn't have the recipe, for that matter. There were also liners that girls could wear in their undergarments that acted like selective vanishing charms when they came into contact with that sort of fluid. Obviously she didn't have any of those, either. She started rolling up a wad of toilet paper with a sigh. It looked like she would be handling this the old-fashioned way for the foreseeable future. She crept back into bed several minutes later, having wrapped the ruined pair of boxes up in a ball and buried them deep in the waste bin. The house elves would be emptying it in a few hours, so she wasn't worried about any evidence being left over. Just as she was settling in, Draco's voice came softly from the bed next to hers. Okay, right. Yes, Rigel whispered back. Were you ill? Rigel frowned in confusion, then realized he was asking if she'd been throwing up in the toilet. Rigel supposed she had been in there a suspiciously long time. Yes, she said, I think it was just something I ate, because I feel much better now. Oh, Draco said, yawning, good night. Night, Rigel returned. Her muscles still ached and she still felt more tired than she thought she ought to feel, but it was with relief that she fell asleep once more. Knowing what the problem was always brought you halfway to addressing it. Oh. HP. Oh. The students didn't have classes the next day, a merciful chance for all the procrastinators to finish their break assignments and an opportunity for the rest of them to get back into the academic mindset before being thrown into classes once more. Not wanting to go to the library when it was so crowded, Rigel decided to walk down to the gamekeeper's hut and ask Mr. Hagrid about the recent movements of the forest creatures. Archie would be proud of her, Rigel thought, for being proactive in finding out what was going on. A small part of her brain reminded Rigel that she wasn't supposed to let herself get caught up in big, secretive events this year. She was supposed to spend time with her friends and leave all the grown-up stuff, like inexplicable pandemics or random petrifactions, to the actual grown-ups. She defended herself by pointing out that all she wanted to do was ask the gamekeeper a few questions. She wasn't going to go gallivanting through the woods chasing crazy and possibly dangerous leads without supervision. Really, it wasn't a big deal. The sun was high overhead when she knocked on the gamekeeper's door. She recognized the sound of a large dog barking. Fang, she remembered, and then the gamekeeper's ruddy face peeked out at her. Why, Mr. Black. Hello. Back, Fang. Sorry, he's just happy for company, that's all. Rigel smiled in a friendly way. That's all right, Mr. Hagrid. Just Hagrid, the gamekeeper said gruffly. Well, Hagrid, Rigel said, I'm sorry to drop in unannounced like this, but I was wondering if you could answer a question for me. Hagrid's face was wary, but he came outside and sat down on his stoop anyway. What, sort of a question. It's about the creatures that live in the forest, Rigel said, sitting down next to him. I figured you'd be the closest thing to an expert on the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid seemed to perk a bit at the word expert and cleared his throat. Well, I suppose I do know a thing or two. What's your question? I was wondering if you'd noticed any of the forest's inhabitants doing anything odd lately. Rigel said, I mean, have animals usually found in certain parts moved to other parts, or disappeared completely? Or perhaps you've found some suspicious remains lying about. Hold up, what's all this? Hagrid peered down at her with a furrowed brow. What are you so interested in the critters for? I'm doing research on what's been petrifying students, Rigel admitted, seeing no harm in being honest. It wasn't against the school rules to look for clues, after all, and Hagrid didn't seem a likely candidate for the person at Hogwarts supposedly reporting to Mr. Riddle. I was thinking it might be some kind of animal, but anything with the power to petrify things must be a predator, and usually if one wants to figure out where the predator is, all one has to do is look at where the prey are moving away from. Hagrid's face turned very white, and he shook his head quickly. I don't know nothing about anything. Don't ask about, just don't ask. Rigel looked up at the big man with concern. Are you all right? I didn't mean to upset you, Mr. Hagrid. Hagrid put a large hand to his head. Just bad memories, young Mr. Black. Never mind, never you mind. Memories. Rigel's interest was piqued. What do you mean? Hagrid flushed purple. Nothing, I didn't mean nothing. Rigel gazed at the older man for a moment, slowly turning the word memories over in her head. Hagrid, has something like this happened before? Does it remind you of something similar, something you found in the forest, maybe? Because some of the things that might be petrifying students are very long-lived, so if you can tell me where and when you remember something similar to the petrifaction, it might help identify it. It's not the same, Hagrid muttered. It's nothing to do with the chamber. Merlin, please, not again. Rigel inhaled sharply. The Chamber of Secrets. Is that the chamber you mean? Hagrid looked alarmed and Rigel shamelessly pulled out her best look, wide eyes brimming with hopeful expectation. Please, Mr. Hagrid. I think you're right, that chamber is definitely connected. After Rigel had overheard the phrase at the gala, she had done some digging, but all she could find were vague myths about a hidden chamber somewhere within Hogwarts itself, built by Slytherin. There was nothing about petrifying kids in the myths at all. Maybe Hagrid knew what the connection was. Hagrid looked extremely uncomfortable. You shouldn't be asking such questions, Mr. Black. Look, you're a good lad. Helped me with Fang's stomachaches and all, but you don't want to get mixed up in this mess. Please, Mr. Hagrid, Rigel said, I know it must be difficult for you, but it's important that we all do our best to figure out what's hurting those kids. We all have to be very brave, and put our information and skills together, or evil will triumph unchallenged. She thought that might have been laying it on a bit too thick, but Hagrid looked at her consideringly. I reckon, you might be right, the gamekeeper said slowly, looking over toward the forest. It's just, you have to understand, it wasn't me. Rigel blinked. I didn't imagine it was you hurting students, Hagrid. Really, I just thought you would know the most about the forest. I'm glad you think that, Hagrid said, his voice heavy with something old and weighty, only that wasn't what a lot of people thought, the last time a couple of kids turned up petrified. Rigel barely suppressed a glint of triumph. Hagrid did know something important. She listened carefully, then with growing alarm as Hagrid told her the story of why he was expelled from Hogwarts, and all he knew of the circumstances regarding the opening of the Chamber of Secrets. All told there were 8 students petrified before it stopped, Hagrid said. But they were all fine in the end, right? Rigel said, I mean, once the petrifaction was cured. Hagrid shook his head slowly. 7 were all right, after a bit of mandrake draft, but the last one, oh, kid, the last one wasn't just petrified. She was. Rigel put a hand on Hagrid's elbow. I understand. I'm sorry. Nice girl, she was, Hagrid said, pulling out a handkerchief and blowing his nose before continuing. After they found poor Myrtle, they had to do something. When Riddle found my Aragog in that cupboard, well, I suppose it was only natural that they assumed I. Hagrid broke off, blowing his nose again. Only I didn't. You have to see, I wouldn't have. Never. I told them to ask Myrtle if she ever saw me when it happened, but she was too distraught, crying and carrying on. They couldn't get a coherent testimony, so they just... That's awful, Hagrid Rigel said, meaning it. A giant spider couldn't have petrified. Wait, did you say Riddle found Aragog? As in Lord Riddle, the Sow party leader? Rigel found that to be a rather difficult coincidence to swallow. Something indecipherable crossed Hagrid's face. Yeah. He was just a kid then, too. A prefect, and all. He found Aragog on one of his patrols. I don't care for the likes of that party much, but it weren't really Riddle's fault what they assumed. Bad timing, I guess. He said this with the blank intonation of someone who had been telling themselves such a thing for many years, either using the statement to comfort themselves or else trying to convince themselves of it. So, then she said carefully, trying not to be insensitive but needing to know, do you think it's the same thing that it was last time? Hagrid shrugged a bit, not sure. The petrifactions look the same, but 50 years ago the ones attacked were all Muggleborns. It was before they were banned from attending, you know. There weren't any explosions, neither. And, back then there were messages. Terrible things, written up in blood on the wall. Another one every 2 or 3 attacks, always going on about mental pure-blood stuff. Slytherin's old propaganda, mixed in with twisted threats and things. Ruddy awful, those were. This time, it's too different to say for sure. Hagrid sounded a bit hopeful as he said it, but Rigel's stomach sank. There had been a message like that, twisted and puritanical, only it had never been seen by more than 4 people. So the 2 incidents, 50 years apart, were somehow directly related. And she also now knew that the threat included and underlined by the killings of Mrs. Norris and her kittens was not idle at all. Whoever had done this had killed before the same way. It made Rigel angry, to think of some poor young girl named Myrtle being killed for no other reason than the blood she bore. What kind of a world did they live in that someone thought an accident of birth worth killing over? She had always thought it unfair that Muggleborns and half-bloods like her didn't get the same opportunities as purebloods, and she had often considered it annoying that she had to go through so much extra effort just to reach the same heights, but never before had she been outraged on behalf of Muggleborns and half-bloods. How dare they think they could get away with this? Rigel could not, let it happen again, even if this time it would be a pureblood with whom the same sick point was hammered home. Her face set into a determined scowl. She was going to figure out what was doing this, and she was going to make it stop, and then she was going to make it regret ever starting. Her magic stirred restlessly within her as her emotions roiled and churned, but with no outlet it could only burn in her gut like a torch, fueling her purpose with its heat and strength. She said goodbye to Hagrid and thanked him profusely for his help. He gave her a few more half-hearted admonishments about getting involved in things she oughtn't, which Rigel solemnly ignored. Rigel stopped at Snape's office on her way back to the common room, intending to pick up that month's list of potions approved for brewing. Before she could ask for it, though, Snape pinned her with a serious look and said, "Mr. Malfoy believes you are ill." Rigel mentally rolled her eyes at her friend. He really was too dependent on authority sometimes. "I felt a bit sour last night," Rigel said, "but luckily it passed. I am completely healthy today." Snape studied her under-lowered brows. "As you appear to be neither ill nor lying, I am inclined to ignore Mr. Malfoy's assessment, this time. Do not neglect your health." "Yes, Sir," Rigel said. "Now, I imagine you are here for this." Snape pulled a piece of parchment from his desk. "How embarrassingly predictable of me," Rigel said, grinning as she stepped forward to take the list eagerly. She looked at it, then blinked. There was only one thing written on it. Polyjuice potion. Rigel felt herself smile irrepressibly. It was nothing she hadn't made before, but still, this is a new potion. It is only considered such because of the tedium involved in both time and preparation, Snape said dismissively. In actuality it is less magically draining than many fourth-year potions, due to the preparation being drawn out over the course of a month. "Thank you," Rigel said, still smiling without conscious effort. "It is not a gift, but a test," Snape said firmly, though he looked thoroughly amused at her reaction. "Do not disappoint me." "I won't," Rigel said. "How many batches can I?" "1," Snape said. "1." Rigel blinked, deflating a bit. She wasn't worried about leaving room for error, but she hadn't brewed only one potion at a time since, actually, she couldn't remember when she had last brewed just one cauldron of something, let alone one potion for an entire month. Make it perfect, Snape suggested. Yes, Sir Rigel said, frowning a bit at how bored she was going to be until February. Snape made an exasperated noise. You impertinent child, stop pouting. You will only be working on one potion in your personal time this month because you will be assisting me in your free time as well. Assisting. Rigel could feel her smile coming back and repressed it with effort. What kind of work will I be assisting with, sir? Snape leveled a look at her that made it clear he could see the smile straining at the corner of her mouth and was not at all impressed by her attempts to dissuade it. My work, Mr. Black. I am in the midst of several experimental and therefore delicate and dangerous projects, and if you do anything other than exactly what I tell you to do, you will wish you were allowed to make one potion a month when I am done locking up your laboratory. Is that clear? Very, Rigel said. Thank you, Professor Snape. I'm so honored that you'd include me in. You will stop that this instant, Mr. Black, Snape snapped irritably. I detest flattery of any kind. All I require from you is an extra pair of hands this month. If you perform adequately, I shall consider allowing you to assist with other projects in the future. Rigel could only nod. She could scarcely believe she was going to see Potion Master Snape's personal projects firsthand. What time? She asked. Every afternoon between your last class and dinner, Snape said, with an additional 3 hours after dinner on the evenings you do not have Quidditch practice. Too much. Definitely not, Rigel said, grinning. Get out of my sight, Snape snorted, your happiness sickens me. I look forward to working with you as well, Sir Rigel said cheerfully as she made her way out. Cheeky brat, Snape tossed out after her. Oh. HP. Oh. End of Chapter 10. The Serpentine Subterfuge. Chapter 11. In classes the next day it was uncomfortably obvious that several students in their year hadn't returned from winter break. 2 Ravenclaw boys and a Gryffindor girl called Lavender Brown had been pulled out of school by their parents. At lunch, Rigel looked around and realized that it must be the same in every year. The house tables were noticeably less full than they'd been before break, with the blatant exception of Slytherin House. Perhaps it was because of what she now knew about riddles, and by extension the Sow parties, connection to the petrifactions, but Rigel thought it rather telling that apparently none of the Slytherin parents were at all concerned about their children's well-being. Judging by the suspicious looks coming from the other 3 houses, Rigel was not the only one who thought so. She wondered if any of the parents knew what was really going on, but rather doubted it, considering how in the dark Lucius Malfoy, the second-in-command himself, had sounded when she'd overheard he and Riddle talking. Probably they had simply been told not to worry, and had taken Riddle at his word. The professors seemed determined to pretend that nothing had changed. They skipped over the missing students' names as though they had never attended Hogwarts in the first place, Neville and Patil included. All of the professors did this, except one. Lavender. Where is Lavender? Lockhart called out expectantly from his teaching platform at the front of the classroom. That's odd, he said, frowning cluelessly. She always sits in the front row. Does anyone know if Lavender will be running late today? The Gryffindors exchanged rather uncomfortable looks, and Ron Weasley finally spoke up. She's taken a leave of absence from school, Professor. Lockhart smiled slyly and winked at them all conspiratorially. A bit of personal time, eh? Well, I'm sure she'll be very beautiful when she comes back. Yes, very lovely indeed. She hasn't gone to a beauty retreat, Pavati Patil said loudly. She's hiding from the monster at home like a scared little girl. Lay off, Parvati, Ron said. If she wants to stay home, well, maybe she's just being smart about it. She's being a coward, Ron Patil hissed back. My own sister got petrified and you don't see me running home with my tail between my legs. Some Gryffindor she turned out to. Now, let's not have any confrontation, Lockhart said hastily. What's all this, then? What monster? Don't tell me you all are afraid of a few petrifactions. He waved a hand with an air of supreme unconcern while the class stared rather incredulously at him. Your friends are going to be fine, children. Why, I am working closely with Professor Sprout to restore them even as we speak. So don't fret. As we speak. Who taught this numbskull English? Draco muttered sourly. What was that? Lockhart turned inquiring eyes toward their table. Did someone have a question? I have a question, Pansy said immediately. Yes, Pansy. What is your question? Lockhart asked, clasping his hands together excitedly. What kind of a monster petrifies people? Pansy said. Draco inhaled sharply and Theo glanced back from the table in front of them to give the blonde girl a surprised look. I'm sorry. Lockhart said, chuckling a bit nervously. What sort of a monster petrifies people? Pansy repeated her question slowly. Well, I'm not sure that's really under the purview of this class, Lockhart said, smiling widely at them. More of a care of magical creatures thing, don't you think? Well, not really, Pansy said, a hint of steel in her prim voice, because a creature that petrifies students would be considered dangerous, and dangerous creatures are covered on the Defense Against the Dark Arts syllabus. If we eventually cover everything from redcaps to vampires, don't you think we should cover something that petrifies people as well? Oh, I see what you mean now. Lockhart clapped his hands. Quite right, Pansy, but that's much more advanced than we are currently. More of a newt subject, I'd say. So you're teaching your newt students about monsters that petrify people, then? Parvati said, raising her dark eyebrows expectantly. Well, we haven't gotten to them quite yet, Lockhart said uneasily. Couldn't you just give us an overview of the different possibilities? Pansy suggested. You could make it really basic, so that we can keep up. Bit sardonic, Draco murmured to Pansy under his breath. She took a deep breath and smiled sweetly. Please, Professor Lockhart. We're just so nervous with everything going on. It would ease our nerves considerably if you would indulge us. Parvati seemed to catch on. Yes, please, Professor. We could go look it up in books, but there's no substitution for real experience like yours. Lockhart seemed utterly at a loss. Well, I understand that you're worried, not that there's any need, with me here to protect you, but I don't know if I can deviate from the syllabus. What syllabus? Draco grumbled. Oh. I've got it. Yes, a marvelous idea, don't know why I didn't think of it before. Lockhart was suddenly very animated once more. Students, you're in for a treat. I have decided, in light of recent events, to sponsor a dueling club. Lockhart's dramatic pose would have fit right in with adoring applause, had there been any. Is he just going to ignore your question? Millicent asked, a bit too loudly in the silence for Lockhart to ignore. No, don't you see? I will teach you all to duel in an extracurricular club, and then you won't have to worry about what's petrifying students. You'll be able to handle it. He looked around at them all with an air of great satisfaction. Yes, that's just the thing. Sign-ups will begin tomorrow. After that he returned to the scheduled lecture on how phone booths could be an unexpected venue of ambush, and the class returned to doing whatever they usually did in defense when listening to Lockhart started to melt their brains. Rigel took out a healing textbook and Draco began working on a transfiguration essay while Pansy frowned into space, thinking. After class, Pansy said, why do we have such useless defense professors? Even with the curse we can't be this far into the bottom of the barrel. Don't worry about it, Pans, Draco said. Rigel and I will help you pass your IELTS. Pansy sighed. Thank you, Draco. Draco huffed a laugh. Can you believe he suggested a dueling club? I mean, first of all he's supposed to be teaching us dueling anyway as a part of our regular defense curriculum, treating it like an extracurricular activity. What a joke. And he can't really think dueling will save us from petrifaction, can he? No one is that stupid. Maybe it's all an act, Pansy said wistfully. Maybe he really is semi-capable, and he acts like a brainless oaf to lull his enemies into a false sense of security. Or maybe he's the one petrifying people with his stupefying incompetence, and one day soon he'll look in the mirror and petrify himself, and they'll have to give us a new professor early, Draco said, also rather wistfully. Or maybe it's all an act and he's the one petrifying people, Rigel suggested. Draco blinked. Actually, that's probably it exactly. I mean, why else would it start this year? The defense professor is the only variable. Him and 25 first years, Pansy said lightly. Draco groaned. If I get petrified by a first year, you two had better not tell my parents. What should we say happened to you instead? Rigel asked, amused. Anything else? Draco said. Say I was mauled by a hippogriff or eaten by the giant squid. Mauled by a what? Pansy laughed. Draco, where do you come up with these things? -0. HP. -0. That afternoon Rigel hurried to Lab 1 as soon as classes were finished. It was locked and warded when she got there, so she waited restlessly for about 5 minutes until Professor Snape arrived. He favored her with an amused look and took out his wand to begin undoing the protections. I didn't wait long, Rigel felt compelled to insist. Snape snorted derisively and opened the door. The lab was as beautiful as Rigel remembered it being, all white countertops and glass cabinets. Unlike the last time she was here, there weren't several cauldrons set up around the horseshoe-like workstations. Instead, there was a single, gleaming cauldron in the center of the semicircle, and an array of stirring rods and prep materials spread out on the counter next to it. Rigel followed Snape into the large, well-lit room. As the potions master began unlocking cabinets and pulling out sheaves of fire-retardant parchment from drawers, Rigel approached the shining cauldron with something like awe. It was larger than most cauldrons she'd ever worked with, and looked like it would hold at least a dozen bottles within it. More amazing than that, however, was its material. Silver, she breathed, examining the cauldron with irrepressible interest. Snape set a stack of parchment on the counter before her and inclined his head shortly. Indeed. You've never worked with the material. It came out as a simple statement of fact, rather than a question or a supposition, and Rigel knew then that Snape knew about Remus' condition, but neither of them mentioned it. The potion we brew today is so complex that in past times it required an additional license for a potioneer to sell it in most magical communities. Snape began, choosing several parchments from the pile and handing them to her as he spoke. Its use has largely died out in the past couple of decades, but it still poses a sizable challenge for most brewers to attempt. The recipe, as you can see, is multifaceted. This is because the potion will not be uniform until the very end of the brewing process. Rigel nodded in understanding. Sometimes you had to treat different ingredients in the same potion in different ways before adding them all together in the final step. She asked, why do we only have one cauldron, then? Read steps 4 through 15, Snape said. Rigel did, and her eyebrows rose. How is that possible? It looked like the recipe wanted them to treat the potion as lead, with the top half of the mixture an essentially different potion than the bottom half. The trick is in the linseed oil. Snape pointed with a long finger to the first 3 steps. There were 2 different bases used. The recipe said to pour the first base in, then add a layer of linseed oil carefully to the top of the mixture, before adding the second base on top of that. The oil insulates both halves of the potion until the final stage, in which a mole is added to break down the linseed oil barrier and reunite the 2 halves. It cannot be done in separate cauldrons because the fusion must be instantaneous. Seconds lost in pouring one mixture into the other would ruin the potency of the entire potion. How will we add the ingredients it asks for to the bottom half of the mixture, then? Rigel asked, won't everything we put in just end up as part of the top mixture? Snape gestured toward a strange-looking apparatus on the countertop next to the cauldron. Do you know what this is? Rigel shook her head. It was just a clear, hollow tube about an inch wide that curved slightly at the bottom. There were runes engraved on the sides, but they were too specialized for Rigel to recognize most of them. She had seen them in apothecaries before, she thought, but had no idea what they were for. Observe, Snape said. He placed the tube vertically in the cauldron and Rigel saw that when it rested in the bottom of the cauldron the tube still came quite a few inches above the rim. Holding the tube flush against the edge of the silver metal, Snape murmured a phrase in Latin and Rigel watched as the tube seemed to flex and move slightly until the edges blurred and fused with the sides of the cauldron. After a moment Rigel could no longer tell where the tube ended and the cauldron began. And it doesn't damage the integrity of the cauldron? Rigel asked. Not in the slightest, Snape said, deftly attaching a funnel to the top of the apparatus. The spells embedded in the tube are extensive. Once activated, they ensure a one-way, pressurized passage through it, so that ingredients may be funneled into the bottom of the cauldron without letting the potion flow backwards up the tube. And with the linseed oil acting as a barrier, Rigel said, this lets us add ingredients to the 2 halves separately. Only, how will we stir the bottom half? Snape made a dismissive movement with his hand and said, you will understand when we reach that stage. but rest assured that it will not be your responsibility." "What will I be doing, then?" Rigel asked. "Some of the steps are a bit tight timing-wise, but it looks like you could easily brew this by yourself." Rigel was wondering if Snape actually needed her help assisting or if it was just a learning experience for her. Not that she'd be any less excited if it was just a learning experience. "Normally I do," Snape said, however. He trailed off and gazed assessingly at her for a moment, as though wondering how much to say. "This potion is extremely draining on my magical reserves. Brewing one cauldron is taxing enough to reduce the secondary layer of my core by half. While this leaves me far from irresponsibly depleted, in these times I believe it prudent to preserve the levels of my core when possible, in case there is an event in which they can be of significant use." Rigel was taken aback. "You want me to imbue the potion, so you can keep your magic ready in case of an emergency?" Snape said nothing, but inclined his head slightly. "All right," Rigel said. It was really a good idea, and Rigel's respect for the potion's master increased as she realized how much thought went into balancing his private projects with his responsibilities as a professor and head of house. She glanced down at the recipe again, but there was no heading or title of any kind. "Sir, what is this potion?" "This," Snape said, "is aconite alleviation." "It is the precursor to the wolfsbane potion," Rigel breathed, not entirely aware that she had interrupted Professor Snape. "This is what they used for centuries, isn't it? Before Damocles came up with the wolfsbane alternative, though of course even that had significant drawbacks in the level of sanity it granted its drinker before Master Snape improved." Rigel snapped her mouth shut as she came back to herself and glanced sheepishly up at Snape, ears a bit pink with embarrassment. "But you already know all of that, of course." "Of course," Snape repeated with dry amusement. "Yes, aconite alleviation has many drawbacks, not the least of which is that over time the amount of aconite present within it slowly poisons the drinker's body. This makes the transformations on the full moon more difficult the longer the drinker lives, but it also builds up an unfortunate immunity to aconite's medicinal effects long term. The result was that the more full moons a werewolf drinking aconite alleviation went through, the more painful and traumatic the transformations would become even under the influence of the potion. At the same time, the drinker grew weaker in body with every dose of aconite, and eventually they would become too weak to keep the beast at bay any longer. The majority of werewolves taking the aconite alleviation potion succumbed to their inner beast and either went wild or perished within the first 10 years of having been bitten." Rigel nodded, looking at the table. Remus always answered their questions about his conditions, if he could, and Rigel had asked him when she had first come across one of Snape's articles on wolfsbane if Remus had ever taken aconite alleviation. Remus had grimaced, and said that Dumbledore had chosen to remove Remus from the grounds every full moon rather than subject him to that potion, whose ill effects were well known by the time Remus was in school. "Still, it is not without its ingenuity," Snape said after a moment's pause. "This potion is the building block upon which wolfsbane was able to be built. It is impossible to do further research on the wolfsbane potion without beginning with the aconite alleviation, and because this potion is significantly less magically draining than wolfsbane is, it is always more expedient to attempt revisions on it, rather than on the actual wolfsbane potion. Wolfsbane is extremely similar to this potion in terms of brewing process and the majority of its ingredients, but it is considerably more volatile. A mistake with aconite alleviation will cost you in ingredients and magical output, but a mistake with wolfsbane can cost you a limb." Rigel nodded, but Snape fixed her with a look so serious that she stopped and just gazed up at him. He said, "You will never attempt to brew wolfsbane on your own." "I won't." Rigel Black, Snape said, staring her down in a way that was frankly starting to unnerve her. "You will never, ever attempt to brew wolfsbane potion without a potions master specifically licensed in its production. Do you understand?" "I understand," Rigel said solemnly. "Say it," Snape said, unimpressed by her comprehension. "Swear to me." "I will never try and brew wolfsbane without a licensed master," Rigel said, then hesitated before adding reluctantly, "I swear." "Good," Snape said, turning back to the cauldron, "then we can begin. Fetch all of the ingredients listed, but do not open the container of aconite until I tell you to." Rigel went to the cabinets to collect the ingredients, and her evening's brewing with Master Snape began in a whirl of chopping and shedding, dicing and splicing. -0. HP. -0. The next day Rigel spent the evening after Quidditch practice in the library. Unlike her dormitory, the peace of the library was fiercely preserved by its caretaker Madame Pince, so it was a perfect place for Rigel to practice her occlumency without being distracted. Also, there were plenty of witnesses in the library, so she didn't feel reckless in temporarily ignoring the physical world while she pruned her mental landscape. The mountain was as cold as ever in her mind, and she shivered a bit in her mental avatar's lightweight potion robes, despite knowing that the chill she felt was, literally, all in her head. Nothing had really changed much since Rigel had repaired her mental landscape in the wake of the sleeping sickness. There was still the decoy potions lab hidden in the mountain, which she was seriously considering modifying now that Snape knew it was a decoy. One could never be too careful. But that was not her task for today. Instead, she would be focusing on her outer barriers that night, the first layer of defense, and by far her weakest. She sighed at the thought of the lovely warm caverns just inside the fake mountain entrance, but turned resolutely toward the edges of her mental landscape. All it looked like was greyish fog to Rigel's inexperienced eyes, but she had read book after book on the subject of mental defense and offense, and all of them agreed that those mists were one of the most important tools at a wizard's mental disposal. The mists were what kept other wizards from even entering the mind. Theoretically, if your mists were strong enough, you wouldn't need any of the secondary protections Rigel had been relying on, illusions and labyrinths and other things meant to throw an intruder off balance. The mists did much more than even defense, though. They were also what allowed a wizard to project his mind into another's through legilimency, which Rigel had yet to even begin to fully understand. She knew that theoretically one could cast their mental energies outward just as they did their magical energy when connecting one magical core to another's. While connecting cores, like imbuing a potion, required the wizard to first extend his magical senses and then throw his magic out like a rope to whatever he wished to latch onto. However, connecting minds was different. To start with, mental energy was entirely different from magical energy, and Rigel still hadn't figured out how to manipulate hers. The clue was somewhere within the mists, but to Rigel they just felt like mist, not some sort of energy she could manipulate. Another difficulty was the way in which minds connected. You couldn't just project your mental energies in a spike away from you, like you could with magic. Instead, the mental energies, once harnessed, had to be cast more like a net than a single rope. The idea was to encompass the foreign mind with your own mental energies, get a mental hold on it, and then attempt to infiltrate it. All in all, legilimency sounded rather disturbing, and Rigel was perfectly content to concentrate on the defense side of the mental arts for the time being. Unfortunately, she really did have to get a handle on the whole mists thing. That was where her mental energies gathered, just like her sun was where her magical energy was collected and stored. She needed the mental energies to really defend her mind, since the most she could do with magic was to change the metaphysical structure and appearance of the place. Mental energies were also very closely tied with auras. A person's aura, as Rigel now understood it, was created when their ambient magical energy mixed with their ambient mental energy around their body. The two energies mixed and sort of solidified one another into patterns depending on a hugely diverse number of factors, everything from what element a person's core sprang from to which magical gifts, if any, they were born with, and even how intelligent a person was could be told from the patterns their aura made when their mental and magical energies highlighted one another. The tricky thing about auras was that they were multi-layered, ever-changing things. What you saw when you looked at someone would never be the same thing you saw when you looked again. Certain underlying features of a person's aura never changed, and those indicators of age, sex, strength of core, elemental affinity, health, etc., were the ones most often noted when a person read someone's aura. Other elements, however, changed as often as a person took breath. On the surface level, for instance, the aura always reflected the exact current state of a person's magic. Overall, the depth and complexity of this pattern didn't change much once a wizard reached majority, but there were nuances within the pattern that could tell you what spell they were using, even before they'd uttered the words, if you could recognize it quick enough. The aura could reveal if a person was under the influence of a potion that affected either the mind or the magic in any way, and what's more, it could tell you if that potion was harming them or helping them. At least, that's what Rigel had read. She had no idea if any of it was true, because she was unable to perceive auras completely. At all. Apparently, in order to perceive auras one had to be able to understand and sense both magical and mental energies. Otherwise one would only get a headache trying to see auras. That last bit she hadn't read anywhere, but her personal experience on the matter was depressingly well developed. Rigel stared bleakly into the fog. She supposed she should call herself Harry in her own head, but really, what was the point? She was as much Rigel as she was Harry anyway. She paused, then shook her head. No, that wasn't true. Why did she think that? The mists were making her depressed, she thought morosely, staring at them a bit harder. Nope, still just swirly grey clouds. She tried going into the mists, but that just made her cold, wet, and blind, and the closer she got to the edges of her mind the more her body tried to wake her from her meditative state, so she quickly backtracked and took to contemplating them fruitlessly for a while longer. Maybe if she sent her magic into it. Rigel conjured up a ball of fire and flung it into the mists experimentally. She could feel it pass through them, with the weird not-awareness that had lingered at the back of her mind since she had first meditated her way onto her mental plane. She felt it ripple warmly through the mists before her and then, nothing. The energy was gone, absorbed by something she couldn't sense or understand. She was about to try again with a bigger ball of fire when she was abruptly distracted by a ghost-like feeling from the physical world. She turned her senses toward her physical awareness and felt someone's hand shaking her shoulder. Giving up the occlumency altogether as a bad job that night, Rigel obligingly returned to the real world, and opened her eyes. Ginny Weasley was bending over her, one hand on Rigel's shoulder and the other holding her red hair out of her face as she peered into Rigel's. "Oh, you're awake. Great." Ginny smiled at her, and Rigel blinked uncertainly back at her. "Yes?" she asked, subtly rolling her shoulders to both dislodge Ginny's hand and to stretch out muscles stiff from sitting in one attitude for so long. "You were meditating, right?" Ginny set her back down on the table with a heavy clunk and claimed the seat across from Rigel smoothly. "Yes," Rigel said, wondering why Ginny had shaken her if she'd known what Rigel was doing. "But you returned right away when I touched you," Ginny said, gazing at Rigel thoughtfully. "You could sense what was happening to you in the physical world." "Yes," Rigel said, feeling a bit repetitive. "For variety's sake," she added, "it becomes second nature to discern between magical, mental, and physical after a while. Your senses sort of get used to the feeling of juggling." Ginny's face was curiously blank, so Rigel couldn't tell if her words meant anything at all to the other girl until she said, "Huh. So I just concentrate on my physical senses and I should be able to tell what's going on while I'm out." Rigel thought that was an interesting choice of words. It wasn't actually like going unconscious, more like going to a slightly separated plan of consciousness, after all, but merely said, "To an extent, yes. It might take a little practice, but you seem to be a natural at the mental arts, so I'm sure you won't have much trouble once you focus on it." "Yeah," Ginny said vaguely. "Hey, will you do me a favor?" Rigel tilted her head inquiringly. "I want to try what you said, to try being aware of my body while I'm meditating. Will you watch it for me while I go under for a sec?" Ginny asked. Rigel was surprised at the request, but couldn't see a reason to refuse. "Of course." "Thanks," Ginny said, settling back into her chair and closing her eyes. "Just make sure nothing weird happens." Rigel wasn't sure what Ginny meant by that, but perhaps she was only concerned for her virtue. She could understand how it would be worrying for a young female to leave her body unattended in a co-ed school. At least, it was probably worrying if people knew your body was that of a young female. Rigel had almost forgotten she was a girl at times, until the bleeding thing that had yet to stop came up. Ginny's form relaxed as she slowly slipped into the reaches of deep, easy meditation. Rigel noticed that it took Ginny about 3 times as long as it did for Rigel to completely sink into the trance-like state, and even then she would twitch every now and again, as though her body was still trying half-heartedly to wake her up. Rigel sat bored for a few minutes while Ginny did absolutely nothing of interest. After Rigel had taken in the dark shadows under Ginny's eyes and the faint lines of tension about her mouth a few times, she decided it would be rude to stare any longer and instead cast her gaze about for something else to interest her. Ginny's book bag caught her eye, slightly open from where she had dropped it with little concern on the table, and Rigel leaned forward a bit to peek at the book titles packed within the small, worn bag. Maybe there was something she'd read before, or better yet, something she hadn't read before. The first 2 titles she could make out were the usual first-year textbooks. The third book was a small, leather-bound journal she recognized as one of the twins. Her esteem for Ginny rose ever so slightly at the evidence that she was at least not so afraid of Fred and George as her brother Ron was. But the fourth book, Rigel squinted at it. It looked like a book on magical maladies of the mind. She was sure she'd seen the same one in Archie's collection, but she hadn't known that Ginny was interested in healing as well. A small sound drew her attention from the spines of Ginny's books and Rigel turned to look at Ginny, assuming she was waking up. Ginny's right arm was twitching back and forth in her lap, her wrist raising just enough to smack against the table every now and again with a distinctive slap of skin on wood. Rigel reached across to quell the movement, but as soon as Rigel's hand touched Ginny's arm, Ginny jerked her body backwards in a stiff, clumsy movement to lean out of Rigel's reach. Ginny's eyes snapped open, wide and dark, glaring at her with such venom that Rigel faltered. "Sorry, I didn't want you to hurt yourself." Ginny didn't answer. Her left hand jerked sideways and back toward her robe pocket, but the next moment she was gasping for air and her eyes had squeezed tight once more. "Ginny, are you all right?" Rigel asked, concerned. She didn't think she'd ever done something like that while meditating. Surely someone would have mentioned it. "Fine," Ginny said, breathing deeply in a way that people only did when they were not fine, but trying admirably to appear so, "just having trouble controlling my physical movements from the mental realm. Trickier than I thought." Rigel slowly relaxed back into her seat. "It is easier to start with just trying to perceive the physical world, rather than jumping straight to affecting it." Ginny shrugged. "Couldn't feel it that well, but I'm pretty sure I moved my arm, right?" "Yes," Rigel offered hesitantly, "you moved your right arm quite a bit, and your left one just slightly at the end there." "My left." Ginny frowned a bit. "I see. Thank you." Rigel nodded, and was considering making an excuse to leave when Ginny spoke again. "Hey, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Rigel said, wondering what could make the youngest Weasley sound so unsure of herself. "How do you keep your mind safe when you aren't meditating?" Ginny asked, a slight frown on her face. "I mean, if you aren't there to watch over it, how do you keep your defenses up?" Rigel had been grappling with that very question herself. "To be honest, I don't have a good enough handle on my mental energies to do what you're describing." "You might ask Professor Snape," Ginny recoiled with a grimace, "or not, but I think he can do what you mean, keeping your occlumency shields fully raised at all times. I've developed mine so that I have a very sensitive awareness at all times, but I can't actually defend them at the level of shields just yet, because I can't manipulate my mental energies." Ginny looked at him, seeming slightly horrified. "Then how do you keep your mind safe? How can you walk around all vulnerable to mental attacks and not?" Ginny took a deep, shuddering breath. "My brothers all wrote to me about the sleeping sickness, you know, how they didn't even notice it creeping into their heads, and it just, why aren't you more scared?" Rigel's face softened. "I am scared, I suppose. I wouldn't mind the extra security of having constant shields like Professor Snape probably does, but there's nothing I can do about it right away. All I can do is study harder and try to understand more, so that I can progress. In the meantime, I'm not exactly defenseless, though." "What do you mean?" Ginny asked, looking at Rigel with hopeful eyes. "Well, the secondary defenses," Rigel said, "like how you have that illusion in your mind. I have illusions too, and mazes, and other defenses that are made of my magical energy, not my mental energy. Those will keep your secrets safe while you get stronger, Ginny. Your mind is very well defended, especially for a beginner. Just keep doing what you're doing." Ginny frowned. "I don't, that was sort of a fluke, you know. I don't really know how I did it. I'm not sure I could do it again." Rigel was confused, but she could see that that was going to be the norm around Ginny Weasley. "I could lend you a book or two on magical mental constructs. Or if you want, I can just come in and show you how to build things in your mind. It might be faster than trying to learn through the book." Ginny flinched and said, "No. That would be, not good. You shouldn't even suggest such a thing. My mind doesn't like even the idea of you doing that again." Once again Rigel noted the peculiar phrasing, but then she thought of how she frequently thought of her magic in terms of sentience, so Ginny using personification to describe her mind wasn't that unusual, really. "Sorry," Rigel said, "I'll just lend you the book, then." Ginny nodded, then said, seemingly out of the blue. If you could have total mental defense, right now, no questions asked, would you take it? Rigel was beginning to get over the randomness of Ginny's conversational patterns, so she took the question in stride. Do you mean automatic full shields or something? Sounds a bit too good to be true. Not exactly, Ginny said slowly, peering at Rigel with an intensity Rigel didn't entirely understand. What if you had like, a guardian for your mind? Someone to watch over it while you weren't meditating. Asleep, awake, distracted, the guardian would make sure your mind was safe no matter what. Would you like something like that in your head, if it meant that your mind would be secure? That depends, Rigel said, thinking about it. If it was a spell or potion designed to do that, maybe. If I had to trust someone else to be in my head in order to protect it, though, well, it would sort of defeat the purpose, you see. But maybe if I was in greater danger of mental attacks, if the probability was higher that my mind would be breached, I guess I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. Interesting idea, at least. Ginny nodded to herself. Yes, though we're all in danger after the sleeping sickness, aren't we? I mean, if something like that can happen once, what's to stop it from happening again? The sickness was bad, Rigel said gently, but it wasn't undefeatable. I think the reason I'm not scared enough to trust someone else with my mind's safety is because, for now at least, my sensitivity to legilimency attacks is enough to keep me calm. As long as I can sense it happening, I feel like I can fight it, at least. Ginny's eyes flashed, but what if you couldn't sense it? Or what if you were up against something too strong to fight, even if you knew how? Rigel shrugged helplessly. I guess I just have to hope that I don't meet anything like that before I'm ready to face it. Ginny's face was blank once more as she said, that's an awful lot of uncertainty to be wandering through life with. She stood, shouldered her bag, and gave Rigel a curt nod before striding off out of the library doors. Rigel leaned back in her chair and let her eyes become unfocused as her brain whirred into motion. Ginny Weasley was confusing, but she had given Rigel a lot to think about. -0. HP. -0. Over the weekend sign-ups for a dueling club were posted in every common room, and it was with great amusement that most students completely ignored the sheets. Then Lockhart announced that the first meeting was mandatory for all defense students 4th year and under. A collective groan went up, but the second-year Slytherins signed their names to the sheets anyway, since no one wanted to be the one explaining to their parents why they failed defense against the dark arts, even if the only spells Lockhart had taught them seemed to be completely made up. Pesky pixie Petronomi. Please. On the evening of the first dueling club meeting, they all filed into the Great Hall, resigned to wasting an hour of their lives. At least, Rigel thought to herself, it would be mildly entertaining to watch Lockhart try and explain how they were to duel a monster that petrified people without telling them what kind of monster petrified people in the first place. There was a raised platform in the center of the hall, the tables all having been pushed to the sides for the evening. Lockhart paced the platform's considerable length, going on about the great and noble tradition of dueling. There were a couple of other professors who had clearly been roped somehow into chaperoning the event standing unhappily at the fringes, including Flitwick and Snape, who stood at either side of the doors. And if you possess great enough drive and ability, one day you can enter tournaments of dueling, and perhaps one of you will even make it to the national championship if you're lucky, Lockhart said, raising his eyebrows and nodding at them all importantly. Why, I've been asked to give an exhibition duel at the national competitions for the last 5 years running, but of course I'm much too busy to spend my time on something so frivolous. So count yourselves very lucky, children, for today you will see something long denied to the public's viewing pleasure. Dueling is a spectacle like no other. It is a noble, oft-forgotten art in which only the most daring and brave come out on top. Boldness and bravery. Blaise raised an eyebrow, and what about cunning? Cleverness. Talent. Hard work, even. Didn't you know, Blaise? Draco drawled, only Gryffindors can be good duelers. Who said that? For once, Draco had not been quiet enough in his disparaging comments about Lockhart to avoid direct detection. Draco, was that you? Lockhart smiled indulgently down at Draco, not noticing the way his eye twitched from being addressed by his first name. Now, that wasn't what I meant at all. Oh, my, but I can see you're not convinced. In reality, The skeptical look on Draco's face had more to do with the fact that he couldn't believe Lockhart had completely missed the sarcasm in his earlier statement, but once again Lockhart proved his talent for misinterpretation. Really, Draco, we can't let you continue thinking that only Gryffindors have what it takes to be dueling champions. Draco's face tightened as students turned to look at him. Most of them had heard his remark, but those who hadn't took Lockhart's words as truth, and a few of the Ravenclaws on the other side of the room glared at Draco. Draco glared back. "That isn't what I said," he said flatly. "Yes, but I am exceptionally skilled at reading underneath the underneath," young Draco Lockhart said with a chuckle. "I'm afraid your insecurity is as clear to me as your hair color." "Ince," Draco clamped his mouth shut and scowled fiercely. "Fear not, Draco, fear not," Lockhart said, "for today I will prove that you Slytherins can do just as good as the Gryffindors with the proper tutelage." "Oh, Merlin, what have you done, Draco?" Millicent sighed quietly from behind them. "In fact, if you all step up to the stage, Draco, we can begin immediately," Lockhart said, waving his hand with a flourish to the stage stairs. "What?" Draco's face slackened from his scowl with surprise. "No. Come now, don't be afraid," Lockhart laughed, glancing around the room as though inviting others to laugh with him. Thankfully, no one seemed inclined to laugh openly at the Malfoy heir. "I'll give you afraid, you overgrown peacock," Draco muttered darkly as he strode to the stairs with all the dignity he could manage, however forced. Rigel sent him a sympathetic look, and thanked Merlin it hadn't been her. Draco lifted his chin proudly as he ascended the stairs, and Lockhart smiled approvingly. "Yes, that's it, Draco, that's it. Well done. How about a round of applause for our brave little volunteer?" There was a bit of scattered, very uncertain applause, and then Lockhart began to give them all, by virtue of giving Draco, a series of opening tips and pointers on dueling basics. This would have been very helpful, Rigel thought, if any of the suggestions had actually made sense. "Always remember to ignore your surroundings," Lockhart was saying. "Don't get too caught up in the cheering and applause, focus entirely on your opponent, and don't worry about anything else around you." "Ignore your surroundings?" Pansy scoffed quietly. "Even I know better than to forget there might be multiple enemies around. Not to mention the lack of attention that gives to terrain. And my final advice is to try not to move around too much," Lockhart said wisely. "It tires you out, and in any case you might fall off the platform." He chuckled winsomely again. "That would definitely not be good. So, I think that's enough pointers. Shall we begin? I'm dueling you." Draco glanced a bit insolently over Lockhart's magenta robes, and several people smothered snorts of laughter. Lockhart smiled genially. "Yes, I know, but don't think about how intimidating I am. Just focus on the duel." Draco smiled back tightly. "I'll try, Professor." "Right." Then Lockhart spread his feet apart and squatted down into a rather awkward-looking plie. He spread his arms wide and bent his neck in a kind of curtsy, holding that position until Draco bowed slowly back at him. "Wands at the ready, Draco. On the count of 3, we begin. 1, 2, 3. Stupefy." A jet of red light sped toward Draco, but Draco had taken a large step to the side the moment Lockhart said 3, so the spell missed. Unfortunately, Lockhart had neglected to put any barriers up around the platform, and the stunning spell shot inches over the heads of several students, who hastily ducked out of the way, before impacting the wall with a dull fizzle. Draco aimed that stunning spell back at Lockhart, who waved his wand in a complicated-looking pattern that was 2 seconds too slow to fully erect a shield charm before the stunning spell hit him. Lockhart wasn't cast unconscious, because it looked like only half the spell got through the shield, but he was knocked on his rear abruptly and he dropped his wand on impact clumsily. Draco lowered his own wand slowly when it became clear Lockhart wasn't going to pull some wandless magic out of his sleeves. "Whoopsie," Lockhart chuckled, getting to his feet and accepting his wand back from some helpful girl in the crowd. "Very good, Draco, you see what a few pointers can do. Even a Slytherin can be good at this, didn't I tell you? It's all about the teaching method. Now, I think we ought to change things up a bit. You and me dueling, well, it's not really very fair, now is it? I mean, with me holding back I can hardly pose a real threat, but if I were to duel seriously with you, well, that would just be cruel of me, you see. What you need is an opponent your own size," Lockhart decided, smoothing his hair back into its rather ridiculous shape, Yes, why don't we get another Slytherin up here, so you can see that it isn't a fluke that young Draco here caught on so quickly. Perhaps a girl. Lockhart said, peering out at the crowd of students. Where's Pansy? I remember she was rather concerned about this whole petrifaction business. Pansy. Merlin, no, Pansy moaned, shifting behind Rigel's form immediately. Draco's eyes went to Pansy, saw her hiding conspicuously behind Rigel, and spoke up immediately. Professor, I wouldn't feel right fighting a lady. No offense, he added hastily, seeing several girls' eyes flash dangerously at him from the crowd. Lockhart paused, then smiled knowingly. Ah, so that's how it is. Never fear, Draco, I wouldn't want to come between blossoming young love. Draco spluttered, and Pansy squeaked from behind Rigel's shoulders, but Lockhart went on blithely. Who would you prefer to duel against, then, Draco? Since you've done so well, I'll let you pick. Draco hesitated for only a moment, then said, Rigel Black. Rigel narrowed her eyes up at Draco, who only smirked down at her before offering her a hand up to the platform. Rigel took it, saying quietly as she let Draco help her up onto the stage, only for Pansy's sake. Draco grinned back at her. Don't you want to prove Slytherins can be duellers too? Not particularly, Rigel said, searching her pockets for her wand. She was sure she'd put it in there. Oh, there it was. She pulled it from the back pocket of her trousers and took her place opposite from Draco. Lockhart stood in the middle, gazing between them with excitement. Now don't be too hard on each other, boys. Don't get carried away. Rigel didn't think that would be a problem, since she was planning on letting Draco stupefy her immediately, so she could ditch the rest of the club meeting by pretending to have hit her head too hard upon falling unconscious, and escape to the hospital wing to get some studying done. All in all, it was a great plan, until Draco called from across the stage, if you let me win, I'll tell Flint to give you extra practice for a month. Rigel frowned slightly. Normally she wouldn't care about extra practice, since she quite enjoyed flying, but that month Snape was letting her assist him personally, on the nights she didn't have Quidditch practice. Inwardly cursing herself for letting Draco get to know her so well, she raised her wand in front of her determinedly. She would fire 2 spells, she decided, then lose. That way he couldn't prove she hadn't tried. Lockhart stepped to the very edge of the platform, and raised his arms dramatically. 1. 2. Rigel called on her magic, letting her core heat up and ready itself for her use. 3. She drew a line of raw magic from her core and shaped it into a tickling charm instantaneously, firing it half-heartedly at Draco's form. He had already moved from its path by the time it reached him, and he grinned at her before shooting a stunning spell her way. Rather than dive to the side, Rigel asked her magic to form a shield charm, one of the very first Kirill had taught them the previous year, and let it absorb Draco's spell harmlessly. No sense it making the people behind her duck, after all. She leisurely shot another spell at her friend, a trip jinx this time, but Draco just raised an eyebrow as it flew over his shoulder, missing by several inches. You're supposed to shoot that one at my feet, Rigel, Draco said with amusement. Why, what does that one do? She asked with a blank look on her face. She heard Millicent and Theo snicker from the sidelines and Draco just shook his head. You aren't even trying, are you? You aren't either, Rigel pointed out. Draco had been waiting indulgently for her to cast a spell before returning, as though they were hitting a bludger back and forth, instead of trying to hit her as fast as he could. Now, boys, you must take this seriously. Lockhart shouted at them in exasperation. If you aren't going to try, what's the point? Draco shrugged and shot another stunning spell at Rigel, who was forced to shield again. She watched as the red light fizzled and went out mere inches from her heart. Good aim, she said. Draco thanked her graciously. Well, now, this won't do. Lockhart said, clearly put out that they were not going to try battling to the death. If you won't fight each other, perhaps you'll fight this. Sneaky snaky serpent sorcerer. Rigel was pretty sure the first 2 words had been completely unnecessary, but the third word had apparently been a real spell, as a long, black serpent shot from Lockhart's wand and coiled defensively in the center of the platform, hissing angrily. What is this? The snake lashed its tail agitatedly as it flicked its tongue out and took in all the confusing smells in the hall. Who calls? Lockhart let out a little chuckle. Isn't this clever? Slytherins dueling a snake. How appropriate. Rigel thought the truth of the matter somewhere closer to animal cruelty, and the look on Draco's face said clearly that he did not find it appropriate at all, but the blonde kept his wand pointed toward the snake warily. The snake turned its head and caught sight of Draco's outstretched wand. "Threat," it hissed. "This is the threat." It began to sway slightly, rearing its head up toward Draco aggressively. It hissed in warning, and Draco's face tightened, his eyes darting from the snake to Rigel, and back again. "Draco," Rigel said, carefully not looking at the snake as she said it, "lower your wand." "Lower my, Rigel, it's poisonous," Draco snapped. "And it thinks you're the enemy," Draco, Rigel said, keeping her voice calm and even, and more importantly, human. "Lower your wand slowly, and it will ignore you." "And then what?" "It goes after you." Draco shook his head. "I'll keep its attention, you do something about it." "I don't know any snake vanishing spells," Rigel said, a hint of exasperation creeping into her tone. "Draco, please lower your wand, before it strikes." Draco looked torn, but Snape's voice rang out as the potion master cut through the crowd of students. "This has gone far enough. Malfoy, Black, do not move. I will take care of." Before he could finish speaking, much less reach the platform, the snake decided it had had enough. It lunged forward, quicker than anyone anticipated, almost as fast as a stunning spell itself, and bared its fangs at Draco's ankle. Draco started the wand motion for a spell, a shield or a stunner. Rigel never found out, but he was going to be too slow, and Rigel's mind was moving too slow to do anything except blurt. "Stop." The snake froze, as did everyone else in the hall. Rigel could feel the eyes of many, too many, students on her as she quietly hissed, "Come here, please. There is no threat." The snake, visibly mollified, slid across the platform and curled up docilely at her feet. Draco was grimacing as the whispers started, and Snape had a very sour look on his face as he finally ascended the platform, vanished the snake, and took control of the situation. "I think there has been quite enough spectacle here for one evening," he said, sneering at Lockhart in unmistakable contempt. "Return to your dormitories, and for your own sakes stop gaping like a bunch of freshly caught flobberworms." The students slowly dispersed, though they did not, Rigel noticed, stop gaping at her like they'd never heard of inheritable magical abilities before. Snape turned to Rigel and said, lowly, "That was an unfortunate decision you just made, Mr. Black, but as it would do little good to berate you for it now, I suggest your return to the common room and spend the rest of the evening, nay, the month, making yourself look as ordinary and harmless as possible." Rigel nodded her head without meeting the professor's eyes. She wouldn't take back her slip, not if it meant Draco would be bitten by a snake of unknown toxicity, but she knew that there would be consequences for it. Not the least of which would be Sirius finding out that his son apparently spoke to snakes. Rigel had no idea how they were going to overcome that problem, but at least she had several months to figure it out before she went home. More pressing were the immediate consequences of the news getting out, like the strange and frankly alarmed looks she was receiving from most of the students around them. "Let's go," Draco said, sparing a moment to shoot Lockhart a scowl before pulling a non-resisting Rigel off of the platform. "Come," Rigel Pansy said, her voice so serene she must have been forcing it, "let's get you boys back to the common room. It's been far too exciting a night, and I was thinking of joining you tomorrow for your little run, if I'm not too tired after all this." "We'd be glad to have you," Rigel said calmly, her face as blank as a puppet's as she allowed Draco and Pansy to guide her toward the doors. Theo, Blaise, and Millicent fell into step around them. Their faces were obviously brimming with questions. Blaise in particular could not seem to stop staring at Rigel, but they held their silence as they helped them navigate through the crowd and into the dungeons. As they got away from the other houses, Rigel noticed that alarmed and wary looks were not the only kind of looks she was receiving. Her fellow Slytherin underclassmen traveling with them back to the common room had an entirely different range of expressions to offer her. Confused, speculative, intrigued, and even excited. She received several admiring glances from people she'd never spoken to before, and Adrian Pusey smiled widely at her as he sidled up to their group in passing. "So that's how you were so good with Evan," Pusey said cheerfully. "Brilliant, Rigel. Do you do translating?" "Not for free he doesn't," Draco said at once. Rigel looked at Pusey bemusedly. "Sure, why not?" "Great," Pusey said, grinning. "Congratulations, by the way." Immediately most of their housemates within earshot murmured similar words of congratulations, and Rigel remembered that this was the traditional response to someone unlocking an innate magical talent in the old families. Actually, ancient tradition dictated something about a feast, and for the very rare magical abilities gifts were usually given, but in current times the tradition had been watered down to a general congratulations. Thanks, Rigel said automatically, feeling that the whole thing was rather silly. She could talk to snakes. So what? As far as magical abilities went, it wasn't terribly useful. It had come up, what, 5 or 6 times in the last year. She thought a metamorphmagus or a natural occlumens had much more interesting and versatile gifts. Snakes weren't especially interesting, once you got to know them. Mostly they just wanted food and warmth and quiet. Not exactly slipping her the secrets of the universe, were they? They made it back to the common room with little fuss, but already she could see younger students sidling up to upperclassmen they knew to quietly tell them everything that had happened at Lockhart's dueling club. They were discreet, of course, but word still spread unbelievably quickly as Rigel made her way toward her dorm room. Don't, Blaze said quietly, a hand on her elbow to gently redirect her momentum toward an unused group of chairs. If you disappear now, it will only foster speculation. Come and sit with us, talk about inane things until people are too bored to eavesdrop, and then play a game of cards or two. It will be better this way. Rigel wanted nothing more than to curl up in her bed and try to pretend her life wasn't spinning much too quickly around her, but she conceded to Blaze's superior understanding of social situations. Pansy's concurring look didn't hurt in persuading her either, and participated on autopilot in a discussion about their history quiz coming up. Pansy thought it would be on the wizarding charter drafted after the royal house fell, while Theo thought it would be on goblin rebellions, like it always was. Rigel thought she couldn't take much more of sitting and pretending she didn't notice everyone staring at her when Rosier and Rookwood joined their group without warning and ended the debate with their mere presence. So, you've finally come out and told everyone. Rosier said, his voice a bit louder than it usually was. That's good news, Rigel. Now we don't have to be so hush-hush about it, do we? Pusey stood from the next fireplace over, completely abandoning subtlety at that point, and called, you knew about this already, Rosier. How? Oh, Rigel told us ages ago, Rosier said airily, smiling coyly across the room. He told all of his friends. It wasn't really a secret, after all. I'm surprised you didn't know, Adrian. Pusey scowled a bit, but shrugged good-naturedly. I suspected, of course. He was always a bit too good with snakes, you know. It's nice to have it confirmed, though, that's all. Rigel was pretty sure Pusey had not suspected any such thing, but she was glad he and Rosier were trying to make it seem relatively unimportant. As though it were an incidental fact coming to light, not a secret she had been shamefully trying to hide. Yes, it's pretty obvious in retrospect, isn't it? Rosier said, I mean, the Blacks had a Parselmouth marry into the family a few generations ago, didn't they? It makes sense. Rigel's eyebrows rose at that. She knew that there had been a Black married to a Parseltongue. Archie had read his ancestor's diary in the Black Library while they were first doing research on the subject, but she didn't know how Rosier had found that out. Pusey nodded agreeably and sat back down without questioning the situation further. Rigel felt the weight of gazes on her lessen significantly after Rosier and Pusey's exchange, and made a mental note to thank both of them quietly later. Well, I'm for bed, Rosier said, yawning for good measure. The common room's awfully crowded tonight, isn't it? Good evening, second years. Congratulations, Rigel. He added with a smirk. Rigel inclined her head. Thank you, Alden, she said, hoping he understood what she was thanking him for. Good evening to you as well. After he left, conversation was a bit less forced, though Rigel couldn't help but feel guilty at Theo and Millicent's slightly hurt expressions. She hadn't meant to slight them by not telling them, but now it seemed as though she didn't trust them enough to confide in them. Which was true, Rigel admitted sadly, but not a nice thing to think about your friends. Blaze's face was inscrutable, but Rigel could only assume he was offended to be out of the loop as well. She made a mental note to try and make it up to them at some point, though she wasn't sure how to go about doing so. After an hour of pretending to be normal, which really only made Rigel feel less normal, the second years deemed it safe to go to bed. The number of eyes that followed their group to the second-year hallway felt significantly fewer than it had upon entering the common room, so it was with hope that Rigel relaxed into bed that night. Hope that tomorrow morning everyone would be pretty much over the surprise of having a Parselmouth in the school, and that life would continue with minimal interruption over the incident. Hope, as she discovered the next morning at the breakfast table under the psychological weight of 100 stares, was not a reliable emotion in the slightest. The universe, apparently, did not care if you had hope for something, and so Rigel turned back to her familiar emotional acquaintance feigned indifference to make it through the day. Her only consolation was that she wouldn't get a letter from Archie ranting at her carelessness for at least a week or two, provided it took Sirius a few days to find out. Oh. HP. Oh. By the time they headed to Transfiguration, Rigel was exhausted. There was something extremely draining about being at the center of attention. It made her want to fidget or flinch or something, and the energy she spent suppressing the urge to squirm under the students' collective gazes seemed to take a disproportionate toll on her energy levels. Then there were the whispers. The Black. You know, the second year who woke all those kids up from comas last year. He's a Parselmouth. I thought he was the good Slytherin. Just goes to show you there are no good. Rigel blocked out yet another mildly insulting conversation and hurried through the door of the Transfiguration classroom to escape the crowded corridor quickly. What a ridiculous load of tripe, Pansy said huffily, claiming her seat at their usual table with no less aplomb than usual. Despite her annoyance, don't people have anything better to talk about? Frankly. No. Millicent leaned on their table as she spoke. It might not seem like a big deal to you three, since you've apparently known all along, but an unknown Parselmouth appearing under everyone's nose is kind of a big deal. Rigel saw Pansy wince slightly at Millicent's words, and felt compelled to say, I asked them not to tell anyone, Millicent. You guys should be angry at me, not them. We aren't angry, Millicent sighed, just feeling a bit out of the loop. Rigel can override the password on the common room entrance, Draco blurted out. Rigel turned to raise an eyebrow at him, and he shrugged, what? You can. And now they're in the loop on that, too. Millicent couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, I do feel much better now. Tell me, Draco, what other secrets has Rigel told you? Draco grinned unrepentantly at Rigel's mildly alarmed look. Oh, lots. Did you know he knows where the kitchens are? Millicent grinned back. You don't say. Oh, yeah, Draco said. Rigel spends his lunch period there sometimes. Millicent blinked. Oh. I had wondered why he didn't eat some days. And did you know Rigel hates healers, but is studying to be one when he grows up? Draco said breezily. Pansy was looked concernedly between Rigel and Draco, but Rigel smiled slightly and Pansy relaxed. It was clear that Draco was only telling Millicent inconsequential things to make her feel better, and Rigel trusted Draco enough to let him decide which things to tell Millicent. Really, Draco didn't know anything too dangerous about her anyway. I thought he wanted to be a potions master, Millicent said, intrigued. That too, Draco shrugged. Honestly, I'm not sure he's made up his mind yet. Right here, Rigel thought to herself. Pansy seemed to be thinking the same thing, but she only laughed as she glanced at Rigel. Tell me something next. Theo said from his seat at the table in front of theirs. Draco put a finger to his chin and thought about it. Well, did you know that Rigel has an inexplicable knowledge of all the secret passages in the school? Not all of them, Rigel said. He hangs with the Weasley twins, Theo said. That's easy enough to explain. Rigel had that knowledge his first day here, Draco said, smirking. That is interesting, Blaise said, joining them. Did you know people are talking about you in the corridors, Rigel? Rigel scowled lightly at Blaise, who was blinking at her innocently. You don't say. And now we're talking about you as well, it seems, Blaise said, dropping his bag on Theo and Millicent's table with an elegant shrug. How special you must feel. Rigel placed her head in her hands. I wish they would all just stop. Then you shouldn't have spoken the serpent language in front of them, Blaise said. It was going to bite Draco, Rigel said. If it was you, would you have wanted me to let it strike when I could stop it? Blaise tilted his head. The venom most likely wouldn't have killed him, considering we have a potions master on hand. Rigel raised a skeptical brow. So in the future I should only use my abilities to help people who would definitely die without my help. You should if you're going to complain when people talk about it afterwards, Blaze said with equanimity. Rigel was going to say something to the effect of her saving her friends from snake bites not being anybody else's business when McGonagall strode into the classroom and everyone quickly claimed their seats. The professor wrote the day's topic on the board and then walked around the room to collect their essays. Rigel pulled hers out and set it on the table, but she was confused. She could have sworn their essay wasn't due until next week. Rigel, what's that? Draco said, frowning at her essay. Rigel looked down at it, but couldn't see what had made him frown. It's my essay. It's on non-stationary transfiguration, Draco said, reading the title. Yes, Rigel said. Both of them frowned at one another. Rigel, that one isn't due until next Thursday, Pansy said quietly. You need the one for today. Today. Rigel opened her bag to root carefully inside. It's on reversing accidental inanimate transfigurations, Pansy said, glancing at McGonagall, who was almost to their table. Professor McGonagall assigned it on the first day back from break. Rigel could vaguely remember an essay on that, now that Pansy mentioned it, but she didn't remember completing it, and she couldn't find it in her bag. She subtly checked through what little of Flint's assignments she had tucked in her bag as well, but it wasn't there. Your essay, Mr. Black, McGonagall said impatiently, hand held out. Rigel swallowed, feeling her ears grow hot. I don't have it. McGonagall looked down at her with concern. You've lost it. Rigel shook her head. I think I forgot about it. McGonagall's mouth pursed. Were you ill, Mr. Black? Rigel shook her head again, this time apologetically. No, Professor. I'm sorry, but I just didn't complete the assignment. Professor McGonagall frowned. 5 points from Slytherin, Mr. Black. You can turn the assignment in next class for half credit. See that it doesn't happen again. Yes, Professor. McGonagall walked away and Draco and Pansy both turned to stare at her. Rigel grimaced, but was feeling just as incredulous as they. She never forgot an assignment. Draco echoed her thought exactly. You never forget your homework, Rigel. What happened? Rigel could only shake her head. I don't know. Don't you have somewhere you write all your assignments down in? Pansy asked. Did you forget to check it? No, Rigel said. It would be monumentally stupid of her to leave a list of everything she had to get done in a week, with little checkboxes for when she completed it. Anyone who caught a glimpse of it would know too much about her daily schedule, even if she only wrote down the legitimate things she had to do. I usually just remember. I'll get you a planner for your birthday, Pansy said, before turning back to the front of the classroom to take notes on McGonagall's lecture. Draco looked at her with poorly veiled concern a moment longer, but eventually turned away to do the same. Rigel took notes automatically, but inside she was panicking. If she could forget one of her own homework assignments, what's to say she wouldn't forget one of Flint's assignments next? If she missed even one essay, Flint would be able to slip the vow of silence he'd taken and tell anyone he liked that she wasn't Archerus Black. And if she had already forgotten something, what was to say she hadn't forgotten something else already as well? Maybe she should have gotten herself a remembrall for Christmas, too. Calm down, she told herself sternly, taking a stabilizing breath or two. I just have to be more careful. I can do this. It's just one mistake, not the end of the world. Feeling a bit better, Rigel concentrated on the lesson, determined to pay more attention to everything from then on. -0. HP. -0. As she walked into Lab 1 that afternoon, Snape's words stopped her in her tracks. Detention, Mr. Black, he said without looking up from his notes. Rigel froze, flicked her eyes to the clock, frowned in confusion upon realizing she was early, not late, then looked back to Snape with a wary expression. Detention, sir, she repeated. Yes, Mr. Black, detention, Snape said, glancing up to glower at her irritably. The head of Gryffindor House has just informed me that I have been placing an inordinate amount of responsibility on a 12-year-old head. She then proceeded to inform me that my assistant, Mr. Black, was neglecting his studies in order to accommodate the additional, unreasonable workload pressed upon him by his potions professor. Rigel cringed internally at the acerbic tone, but outwardly attempted to remain calm. Is assisting me this month an unreasonable amount of work, Mr. Black? Snape asked with deceptive silkiness. No, sir. And do you feel detrimentally encumbered with responsibility disproportionate to your age? Snape asked. No, Sir Rigel said unhappily. And are you neglecting your studies, Mr. Black? Snape asked quietly, his gaze piercing her with its perception. Rigel's eyes tightened with denial, but she said, a transfiguration essay slipped my mind this week. It was a simple oversight, but Professor McGonagall appears to have taken it to be indicative of an underlying problem with my time management skills. Then detention it remains, Mr. Black, Snape said, turning back to his notes. I warned you not to let your studies slip. They haven't, Rigel protested, it was one essay. It's not that I didn't have time, or was too tired or something. I just forget. You just forgot. Snape sneered at her. And what happens when you just forget to take the cauldron off the fire before adding porcupine quills? What happens when you just forget that powdered erumpent horn can never be mixed with dragon bile? They both knew exactly what happened when those things occurred, so Rigel said nothing. See to it that you don't just forget again. Rigel wanted to argue, to say that that was different. She would never forget a potion's recipe, much less the most important and dangerous step in a potion recipe, but she pressed her lips together and bowed her head in acceptance instead. Get out, Snape said quietly. What? Rigel looked up, shocked. Surely he wasn't dismissing her just for that. Please, it won't happen again. I promise. Get out, Snape said again. Go write your transfiguration essay and come back tomorrow ready to handle your responsibilities more carefully in the future. Yes, Sir Rigel said, both relieved that he wasn't getting rid of her altogether and disappointed that she would miss a day of assisting the potions master. She knew better than to argue at that point, though, so she bowed stiffly to Professor Snape and retreated from the lab quickly and quietly. In the hallway she slid to the floor and cradled her knees to her chest. How could things go so wrong so quickly? First the parcel tongue thing, then the essay, and now Snape was disappointed in her, too. She had to do better. Rigel clenched her fists and allowed her eyes to flash with hard determination. She wouldn't slip up again. She would show them all that Rigel Black didn't bend under pressure. She would prove that she could do anything the pure-blooded kids could do, better. She stood slowly. She thought about going back to the common room to do the essay like Snape had suggested, but she could finish it tomorrow before Quidditch practice. Instead, she walked slowly up toward the kitchens, thinking she could surprise Binny with a visit if the house elf wasn't terribly busy with dinner preparations. Something about Binny always cheered her up. She had just reached the basement corridor that intersected with the kitchen corridor when something in the hall ahead of her made her slow down, narrowing her eyes in the torchlight to discern what she was seeing. In the middle of the hallway, lying stiff as a board on the cold, stone floor, was a boy in Hufflepuff robes. Rigel hurried forward, dread growing in her stomach. The boy had sandy hair and lots of freckles. There was a prefect badge on his robe and his wand was frozen in his hand, half raised but utterly useless in its petrified state. On the wall behind him were large, red letters, so wet that they glistened as she read them. You can't silence me forever. 4 more months. 4 more victims. And when the 5th one won't wake up, you know who to blame. Rigel took out her wand after memorizing the message and asked her magic for a water charm, so that she could wash away the words before anyone else saw them. Instead of water, her magic decided to conjure fire from her wand instead, and Rigel yelped, before sighing. The flame at the end of her wand wasn't very big, but it did seem hot enough to make the blood on the wall melt and run, so she moved her wand along the words slowly until the red ran together and made the message indistinguishable. She was almost finished when a voice came unexpectedly from behind her. What are you doing? Rigel jumped and ended the flame abruptly. As she turned she let her left hand trail behind her to smear the remaining few words surreptitiously so that they couldn't be made out. A Hufflepuff boy who looked to be a year or two older than her was walking toward her from the end of the corridor that branched off toward the Hufflepuff common room. Rigel stowed her wand away, kept her left hand slightly behind her back, and opened her mouth to explain when the boy caught sight of the prefect on the ground. Benjamin, the boy rushed forward, dropping to his knees. What's wrong with, oh, no. He's petrified, Rigel said quietly. Will you stay with him while I go get help? The boy looked up at her, confusion written on his face. Why didn't you get help earlier? What were you doing with the wall? Is that blood? Rigel knelt down and looked the older boy in the eye. Yes, it's blood. I was checking to see if there was a purpose or pattern, but it looks like whoever did this just painted the walls with it. The boy looked green, so she said, just stay here with him, okay? I'm going to grab a house elf from the kitchens. The boy's face firmed and he nodded once, putting a hand on the petrified prefect's shoulder comfortingly. Rigel stood and hurried around the corner down the kitchen corridor. She tickled the pair impatiently and stuck her head in long enough to shout, "Binny," into the din before ducking back out again. Binny appeared in the hallway with a small pop, and curtsied, "How can Binny be helping you?" "Binny, go get Dumbledore," Rigel said without preamble, "there's been another attack." Binny's eyes welled up with water, but she disappeared with another pop and 2 seconds later reappeared in the same place, a disoriented headmaster attached by his robes to her little hands. "Binny, what is the, Mr. Black, did you ask Binny to retrieve me?" Dumbledore turned serious blue eyes on her, and Rigel nodded. "There's been another one," Rigel said tightly, "this way." She set off back up the corridor, Dumbledore sending Binny gently back to the kitchens before hurrying after. They rounded the corner to see another boy kneeling next to the petrified prefect, in addition to the first Hufflepuff Rigel had left there. The two boys were arguing in low voices, but in the empty corridor they could be heard easily as she and Dumbledore approached. "But who was it, Cedric?" the younger of the two asked. "That black kid, you know, the one everyone's talking about," the first Hufflepuff said. "He was here when you got here." "Yeah, just looking at the walls." Dumbledore shot her a look, and she nodded in response. She would tell him later. "And you just let him go?" "Well, what was I supposed to do? I couldn't leave Benjamin. He said he was getting help." "Yeah right, he's not coming back to the scene of the..." "Mr. Macmillan, Mr. Diggory," Dumbledore interrupted, striding to a stop behind them. Rigel had slowed down as they reached the boys, and ended up standing behind Dumbledore as the headmaster took in the scene. Both young Hufflepuffs whirled, looking up at Dumbledore with surprise. "Professor." "Headmaster." "Benjamin, his..." "I know, Mr. Diggory," Dumbledore assured the older, more worried-looking Hufflepuff calmly, "it's all right. He's been petrified, but Mr. Watts will be just fine once Professor Sprout's mandrakes are ready. Everything will be fine, Mr. Diggory." "That black boy was here," the other boy, Macmillan, who Rigel recognized from some of her classes, spoke up with a tone of importance. "He ran off before Mr. Black came to get me." "Yes, thank you, Mr. Macmillan," Dumbledore said. Rigel stepped out from behind Dumbledore awkwardly and inclined her head politely at Macmillan, who narrowed his own eyes back with easily read suspicion. "What should we do now?" Diggory asked. "I'd like to ask one of you to..." Before Dumbledore could finish his sentence, he whirled toward the wall, not the wall with the blood on it, the other one. Rigel barely had time to notice, with something like horror, that there were runes inscribed on the stone before it exploded with a deafening bang. Rigel could feel her magic responding without her conscious direction, and as frightening as that was, it was nothing to the frozen moments of panic as the wall rushed out toward her. Then time sped up again and Rigel flinched backwards, putting her arms up in a cross to cover most of the vital parts on her head and upper torso out of sheer instinct. Magic was hot in her veins, and when the sound of falling rubble stopped, all she could think was that she didn't feel pain anywhere. She lowered her arms slowly, shaking slightly, and looked around. Sometime in the confusion, Dumbledore had flung himself between the wall and the three of them, arms outstretched. A shimmering dome of gold magic pulsed before him, shielding them all from the blast. Not a speck of dust crept through the shield, and Dumbledore turned without dispelling it to ask, "Is everyone all right?" He paused, staring, because behind him, spread in front of Rigel and the two Hufflepuffs, was a thin, shaky blanket of red-colored magic. Rigel could still feel the magic draining rapidly from her core to fuel it, but couldn't concentrate long enough to make it stop. It was nothing as impressive as Dumbledore's shield, but the headmaster smiled at her anyway, and nodded his head in thanks. "Quick thinking, Mr. Black. 5 points to Slytherin for protecting your fellow students." Rigel glanced at the Hufflepuffs, who she suspected had merely been lucky enough to be behind her when her magic decided to shield her, and smiled weakly. They stared at her like she had just spoken Mermish. Dumbledore released his shield with a wave of his hand, and after taking a deep breath to calm herself, Rigel asked her magic to stop, whatever it was doing. She was pretty sure she hadn't learned that shield charm yet. The red shimmer of magic faded away, and Rigel slumped a bit with exhaustion. Whatever it was, that had certainly taken it out of her. She probed at her magical core with her senses and judged the secondary layer to be almost 3/4 empty. Her few remaining coils were twisting on the surface agitatedly, and the center still burned as though ready to release more raw magic at a moment's notice. Rigel made a mental note to look up the effects of adrenaline on magical cores. Things moved fast after the explosion. Dumbledore sent Diggory to the hospital wing to collect Madame Pomfrey, but he wasn't quick enough to make an announcement sending all the students to their common rooms before the Hufflepuffs, who were closest to the explosion, began spilling into the corridor in confused disarray. Macmillan spotted his friends and ran over to tell them what was going on. Rigel shifted awkwardly under the looks she was receiving, being the only one besides the headmaster standing in the middle of the destroyed corridor, and shifted a bit closer to Dumbledore's reassuring form. Snape arrived on the scene soon after, taking in everything with a glance and positively glowering when he caught sight of her. Rigel winced to think of how much trouble she was going to be in this time. Madame Pomfrey arrived with Sprout on her heels, and they carefully levitated the petrified prefect, Wakes, Rigel thought Dumbledore had called him, down the corridor and toward the nearest stairs. A group of Slytherins turned up as Pomfrey and her charge left, and to Rigel's misfortune Daphne Greengrass was among them. Black. She let out a laugh that was not at all humorous. Caught red-handed this time, were you? Let's see you talk your way out of this one. Rigel looked down at her left hand, which was, incidentally, still red with blood from where she had wiped away the last part of the message on the wall, and admitted that things definitely didn't look too good when you put them like that. Apparently she wasn't the only one who thought so, as Macmillan shot his friends knowing glances and they in turn glared at Rigel from the Hufflepuff ranks. I stumbled and used this hand to steady myself against the wall, Rigel said, grateful that Diggory wasn't there to contradict her, if he would have even thought to. Give it up, Black Daphne sneered, it's just pathetic now. You're pathetic. Rigel turned gratefully as Draco pushed his way through the growing crowd. Are you all right, Rigel, he said. Rigel shrugged one shoulder uncomfortably, don't I look all right? Draco shrugged as well, Pansy told me to ask if I found you before she did. I sent her to check the common room because, well, it seemed safer. Sort of knew I'd find you here, though. Rigel couldn't even fault her friend for assuming that. Fate, it seemed, hadn't been able to resist once Rigel took the name of a star. Desist and disperse at once, Snape said, raising his voice to be heard over the pandemonium. Go to dinner or go back to your common rooms, but unless you'd like to stick around and confess, get out of this corridor. The corridor slowly emptied, much to the disappointment of several Gryffindors, who arrived looking as though they'd run all the way from the 7th floor to seek out the commotion. Rigel hesitated. She still had to tell Dumbledore about the message, but if she stuck around it would look like she did have something to confess. Snape solved her dilemma by saying, Black, wait in my office while the headmaster and I repair the wall. I have an extra potions assignment to go over with you before tomorrow. Rigel nodded, understanding that this way she'd be out of the way but still around for them to question, and, after reassuring Draco she was fine, Rigel left swiftly for the potions master's office. She sat there for some time, wishing there was a sink in the office so that she could wash her hands. As it was, she stood gingerly in the middle of the room, careful not to touch anything. The door to the small office opened and Snape stalked in, followed closely by Dumbledore and, to Rigel's surprise, Professor Sprout. Rigel didn't entirely like the look Sprout was giving her. It was slightly suspicious and more than slightly insulting, considering it was coming from a professor that Rigel actually respected. Mr. Black, thank you for waiting, Dumbledore said, fixing her with a serious look. I can only assume by your unfortunately colored fingers and the smeared blood on the wall that there was another message. You destroyed it. Rigel nodded. It seemed best if the perpetrator's intentions were thwarted where possible. Did you memorize it? Snape asked. At Rigel's affirmation he produced a sheet of parchment and a quill. Write it down. Rigel carefully copied the message word for word onto the parchment, using her left elbow to hold the page while she wrote, to avoid covering it with bloody fingerprints. Another message, Albus. Sprout's round face was pinched tight with anger and frustration. I'll not have you keeping secrets while my children are in danger. Explain. Now. Dumbledore inclined his head after he'd lifted it from the parchment Rigel handed him. Very well, Pomona, I will explain. He related the killing of Mrs. Norris in all its horrifying detail. Sprout looked near tears by the end of it, all the anger drained out of her, so that's why Argus took a leave of absence. I was so happy for him, thinking he'd finally gotten around to a much-needed vacation. Oh, who would do such a thing? The same person who did it last time, Dumbledore said sadly. Rigel fought to keep her face blank and uncomprehending as Snape shot her a look and cleared his throat meaningfully at the headmaster. Dumbledore would have been there, she realized, when Hagrid had been expelled. He had made the same connection she had. They asked her a few more questions, but Rigel hadn't heard the voice that time, presumably it had come and gone from the opposite direction. Snape looked slightly mollified that she hadn't gone chasing mysterious voices after he'd told her not to, but he still seemed annoyed with her when he excused her at last and asked Sprout to escort her to the Slytherin common room while he and Dumbledore returned to the area of attack to run a few more diagnostic charms. From what Rigel gathered, Dumbledore had recognized several of the runes on the wall before it exploded, and wanted to investigate his theories. They walked in silence for a bit, Sprout's face tight and unapproachable. Rigel felt like she ought to say something, since it had been a Hufflepuff who was attacked. Professor, she glanced up at Sprout from the corner of her eye carefully, I didn't do it, you know. I would never just attack someone like that. Sprout blinked down at her, as though she had been thinking hard about something and forgotten Rigel was walking next to her. The older woman's eyes softened. Oh, Mr. Black, I know that. Rigel must have looked uncertain and skeptical, because Sprout stopped and placed a hand on Rigel's shoulder, saying, You're no killer, Rigel Black. You think I can't see that? Your presence at the scene, again, merely startled me out of my common sense for a moment. Don't go listening to what the other students might say, now. We'll catch the true culprit and everything will go back to normal, you'll see. She took Rigel's left wrist and used her wand to carefully siphon the drying blood off her hand. Then Sprout conjured a stream of cold water from her wand to rinse the grimy feeling from Rigel's hand completely. There now, you go on to your common room, Sprout said, smiling kindly down at her. Rigel smiled back tiredly, thank you, Professor. See you on Friday. Sprout watched her walk to the other end of the corridor where the false wall was and waited until Rigel had murmured the password and slipped into the opening to walk away. Rigel didn't even want to think about what the eyes of the common room thought of her that time, so she avoided looking at anyone as she strode briskly across the big, low-ceilinged room and into the safety of her dorm room. Millicent, Theo, Blaise, Pansy, and Draco were all already inside when she reached the room, and none of them looked at her with anything other than concern and sympathy as she mechanically pulled a clean overrobe from her trunk and changed into it. Her school shirt and pants were relatively clean, so she didn't bother changing them as well, instead just shucking her shoes and sinking onto her mattress bonelessly. Pansy moved from Draco's bed to Rigel's and began combing the dust out of Rigel's dark hair with her fingers. The other four sat silently, not pestering her or asking her any questions, just sitting there with her until she sighed, sat up, and began to tell them what she felt she could. She told them who had been attacked, how she'd come across them, what she, Diggory, and Macmillan did respectively in response to the situation, and how Dumbledore handled it from there. She didn't tell them why Snape kept her behind beyond just general questioning. She didn't tell them why there was blood on the wall or the real reason her hand had been covered with it. She didn't tell them about the connection she and Dumbledore had made independently between their petrifactions and a similar string of events that had happened 50 years ago, and she certainly didn't tell them that sometimes right before an attack she could hear the serpent tongue bleeding from the walls. The other 5 second years took her words for what they were, all she could give them, and by unspoken consensus moved on to talk about other things. None of them felt like going to dinner, so they ate some of the cookies Pansy's grandmother routinely sent her and sat in the little dorm room instead, just passing the time in a seamless semblance of calm. Rigel could only conclude that friends were an incredible thing. How strange to have people who so understood and respected what she needed. How valuable to have people who made her feel so at ease and unthreatened, despite the difficult, dangerous deception she wove her life within. Surely there was nothing in the world so necessary as a friend on nights such as these. -0. HP HP HP. -0. End of chapter 11.